are completely in it.
Yes.
Yeah, focus somewhere else.
So is there anybody here who can help me make sure that I can get my PowerPoint up on the screen?
You're on it.
What?
Take a few dollars. You're right.
I feel like you ran out of
Yeah, let's know.
You're yelling at the guy.
I got 105.
I'm like, bro, I got
You're riding, I was just yelling at him.
I know you were going at him.
Oh, my kids. I didn't go to UF, but my kids are both Gators, so. Okay, so where? Like, down here?
So what
I was at this shopping airport where you can talk about some food here. So I had that breakfast with this bag that was made he said it's it sounded like to me she was saying made by a man. And so I made a joke. I said that's good. And they just they wouldn't sound like it. It was so funny because they thought I really meant it, but then they realized I was joking.
What's your grade?
Yeah, they know. Yeah, like struggling with that. But that's why it's funny because maybe I didn't understand what he said or I thought.
Yeah. Let me just make sure the camera's facing correctly.
Alright. I'm going to circulate a sign-up sheet. Find your name and initial. I might actually call you out and look you in the face as a process of trying to learn who you are and your names. So Anthony Alexino.
He emailed you that
He
he wouldn't
did.
be here.
He did, okay. Miriam Barber. Because I'm going to hand it to you. No Miriam? Brandon Bell. I'm going to start with you. And then we'll just let you pass it on. Britton. Welcome. My name is Tracy Lautenschlager. I've taught this class a few times, but not in a while, so I'll get less rusty as time goes on. I'm an attorney with the law firm Greenberg Traurig. I'm a shareholder with the firm now. I started my career, just a little bit of background of why I'm the one teaching this. I started my career as an attorney with the Broward County Attorney's Office. I was hired to do land use regulation in 1988 when comprehensive planning in Florida had really just sort of taken hold. A statute had been adopted in 1985 that made comprehensive planning mandatory, and city and county governments were all had their hair on fire trying to develop the expertise that they needed to implement that law. So I was interested in land use development regulation and found that it just really caught my attention. I took a land use law class in law school, and I interned in a city attorney's office at the same time when I was helping them prepare a zoning case for trial. So I was getting the practical and the theoretical at the same time, and I finally kind of realized that it was an area of the law that really held interest for me. So then I did land use and environmental regulation for Broward County for a number of years, and then I was there a total of 16 years, and eventually represented the airport, which is not related much to this class at all, but I did all kinds of work for the airport. But then I went into private practice, again on the developer side of land use law. And I've been with Greenberg Traurig for almost 15 years now, so that's what I've been doing. And the practice of land use law can be small and detailed, and it can be big 1,000-acre projects. So it's a pretty broad area of practice. Let me find out a little bit about you all. So I'm gonna have you make some introductions. You get to start. So tell me who you are, how long you've been in the program, what your undergraduate was, and what your current situation is if you're working in the industry at all.
My name's Armando Martir. I introduced myself to half these people like 5 hours ago.
Okay.
I've been in the program for about 5 hours. And I'm a property manager.
Okay.
So I manage properties in Florida and North Carolina. And I have an undergraduate degree in business administration.
Do you have a CAM, or you're more of a...
No, I am my own candidate.
Okay. But you don't have that certification?
No, I don't have certification.
Yeah, my name is Edgar. My undergraduate degree is computer programming. I've been a programmer for the last 15 years. And I've sat with those programmers something new for me.
Okay.
That's my personal experience.
Hi, my name is Chanel. I currently work here at Nova in financial aid. I did my undergrad here in psychology, and this program really interested me. I took some undergraduate courses kind of relating to real estate, so very interesting.
Okay.
My name's Salik. I'm with Suffolk. I've been in the construction side for about 8 years. My undergrad is in civil engineering, and I'm here to see what my clients, what's important for them, how we can help.
As a general contractor, understand the developments.
Absolutely. Yep.
Got it.
My name is Erin Black. My undergraduate degree is in urban and regional planning, but I studied a bunch of different things before I got into business. I just got a job at Key as a planner.
Okay.
Yeah. So before that, I did business development for salts. Before that, I worked for a developer, and I specialize in entitlements and site planning. It's like my passion, what I love to do.
You did business development for Salt Michelson? Oh, I wonder if I met you at a UI thing or something with,
Probably. That's
with
how I
Charles.
know. Yeah, probably. I'm
Yeah.
very, very involved in UI.
Anybody else need this? Where?
Yeah. He's involved.
Okay.
But I'm in the program because I want to have my own land development firm eventually. So I don't need to learn about the finance aspect.
Okay. Aaron.
Yes.
Alec. Ed. Chanel.
Hi, my name is Oslin Volk, but everyone calls me Oz. Should be real simple to remember. I have a undergrad in nursing and business. I'm currently a property manager with, not for anyone big, for an attorney actually, and a land use attorney in Pittsburgh. And I have a broker's license in Florida, nursing license, a CAM license, I'm a notary, and that's it.
She's a one-stop shop.
That's always useful, yes.
My name is Brian Souza. I'm undergrad in business management and supervision. Obviously, attending this as my master's. I currently work for Lennar in sales, and I've had my real estate license for 8 years.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Adriana. I went to the UF. I got a degree in political science. I currently work in insurance. And I've been in the program since last August.
Okay.
Hey, I'm Alex Cohen. I'm from Florida State. I got a psych degree and been in the program since the fall. I just started working in my family business at Ross Realty at the beginning of the year. So I'm here just to try and gain all the knowledge I can. I got a psych degree, so I didn't have any good background to get into the business.
You said FSU, I almost said, oh, I'm sorry, but that's just, I'm just being a brat. because
Both my
kid-
parents went to
Because my
UF,
kids
so.
went to UF. Next.
I'm Kyle Tuthill. I graduated from Bethel University undergrad in Bachelor's in Finance. Started this program when I got my new job at Styles last year.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that in the email that you're right
Yes.
nearby.
Yeah, so I'm an investment analyst on the financial services side.
Okay.
Data chain and
Okay, what industry sectors do you typically work in?
Mostly, I do a lot with debt, loans, underwriting deals, so multi-family receipts, so.
A little bit of
Yeah, a little bit of everything.
office, hotel?
Yeah, office, no,
No
hotel.
hotel, okay.
I'm Brandon Bell. I'm a project manager for Landmark Custom Homes. I did my undergrad at Florida State, my graduate degree in real estate, and I've been programmed since last fall.
Okay.
My name is Juliana. I have a bachelor in architecture from Brazil. Almost in the end of the program. I am in next term.
Can you repeat for me, I didn't hear you, what your undergrad was in?
In Brazil. I'm
In
from
Brazil,
Brazil,
okay.
yeah, in architecture. And my family has a real estate company that they work with development back there. So I started the program to get more into the business.
Okay. Next.
Hello, my name is Kenneth Beneby. This is my first semester. I have at least 24 years of teaching experience in education, ranging from secondary to post-secondary. However, I've decided to match the academics with the experience that I have in real estate. Former business owner, and I hope to develop some land in the future.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Alex. I did my undergrad at Emory in Atlanta. I graduated with a bachelor's in economics, and I currently work as a financial analyst at Kai's commercial division in Delray Beach. I'm really interested in going into acquisitions management, so I'd love to go as a financial analyst, and my main goal is to become an acquisitions manager.
My name is Andrew Schneider. I graduated with a bachelor's in architecture from the University of Miami, and I started this program in January. Don't currently work in the real estate industry. I work for a small architecture firm in Miami.
What kind of projects?
Residential, small residential, small scale.
Okay.
My name is Nathan Johnson. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, business. I have a master's here in Nova in organizational leadership, and I currently work for the U.S. State Department.
The State Department?
State Department, yes.
Okay. That's interesting.
Hello, my name is Cynthia Garcia. My undergrad is in professional finance technology. I am in my last term, so I'm almost done.
Okay.
I love it.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I was ready for the last of it. My name is Christina Gibbons. I have my undergraduate in marketing from FIU. I have a bachelor's in HR here from Nova. I work as a consultant for an international investment company.
Okay.
Yes, hi, my name is John O'Hara, and I'm a practicing attorney in Boca Raton. This is actually my fourth program here at Nova, so I finished my MBA here, my JD, and eventually I want to transition into kind of what you're doing, land use law. So I was primarily in real estate litigation for about 10 years. I'm kind of transitioning.
Okay, so making the facts instead of just dealing with the facts.
Right.
All right.
James Carter. I'm an undergraduate in history from Norwich University. I have my MBA from Nova, and this is my last term in course year.
Okay. So let's do some more business, but let me first ask, so what, any of you who can talk to me about, you had an experience with zoning. You wanted to put an addition on your house and it would have violated the setback, so you had to deal with that. Any experience, particularly with zoning, in your work experience or your personal lives yet? Has anybody crossed paths with it? Okay, just tell me a little bit about it.
So my brother and I, we own a house in the Keys, and we wanted to put a deck off it on the water, near the water. We want to expand our deck to basically have like an outdoor kitchen below it as well. And we can only go so close to the water, and I think we were over like 2 feet, which we wanted to do. We couldn't go past that where our deck is currently at, so we like to just scrap the idea.
Really, you scrapped the whole project? You didn't revise the project and reduce the
Exactly.
size?
Our next door neighbor's a contractor, who's gonna do it for us, and he drew it all out and all the architectural plans as well, and we went to the city and said, you can't do that. There's no way you can expand your deck and make an outdoor kitchen.
Okay, other experiences, yeah?
My father and I, we applied for a grant for the city. They were going to offer us the grant. However, due to zoning and parking regulations, we were required, the only way we could get the grant if we purchased the empty land next to us so that we can expand our parking. However, we decided to turn it down. So that was the situation for.
Okay, yeah, the tail, parking is like the tail that wags the dog sometimes in planning. Other experiences? Go ahead.
Like 3 years ago, we have a property in North Carolina, in Farmington, North Carolina, and it's about 12 acres. And on this 12 acres, it sits an apartment building of 550 units, and the residents wanted a pool. Right? In North Carolina, not many pools. They wanted a pool, so we tried to figure out how we would build a pool. But apparently, the zoning laws didn't allow us to build a pool, but it allowed us to build a lake. We could dig and infuse water into this hole and make a lake. We were not allowed to make a pool because the zoning laws didn't allow us for some reason. So that was one experience. We ended up building a lake instead of.
Were the residents happy?
Yeah, it was great. They go canoeing and they fish and they do whatever they want.
Okay.
Better than pool.
Okay. Did you ever want to? I mean, if you're doing real estate litigation, I'm sure you do.
Well, it was kind of new. I had a client that was interested in, he just got a 501c3 to do an animal sanctuary, and he was interested in purchasing 2 parcels of land in Palm Beach County, and it was currently zoned agricultural residential. And he had an investor, and each parcel, one was about an acre, one was about an acre and half an acre. Each property had a structure on it, residence, and there was no problem. He wanted to convert the property because it's something to do with only so many animals were allowed per acre or on the amount. And if they combined it, it would be allowable with the additional animals. But the problem was that with each structure, you could only have 1 per lot. So if you combine them, those 2 structures no longer allowed. But it got into where you could change it to where it would be a caretaker residence or something. So that was. And that's what they lost the deal anyway. So
an interpretation to allow the second structure to remain.
Right. We pretty much had to go on everything. That was the last option.
Yeah. So what was, overall, did you feel like, well, these are regulations that make some sense? Did you understand, when you encountered them, did you think, you know, I guess I can understand why they wouldn't want me to build any closer to the water. I guess I can understand why they want to maintain 1 structure per lot? Or was it like, this makes no sense, boom, your head wanted to explode? Both experiences?
Well, no, I think, well, you can see from the city's perspective, I think every area, because the South Florida is growing at such a rate that I think the city is trying to look forward, or the county, if it's unincorporated, that they have a certain plan, and they want you to go according to their plan. And if you want to alter that plan, then you have to go to them with your proposed plan and say, this is what we're looking at doing, how to go about doing that. But if you, I think, go according to a plan, I think it's a little easier to get through all the steps to complete the project. But
Did you find the government staff that you encountered to be knowledgeable and helpful or frustrating?
No, they're very helpful.
Was that your experience too, even if it was bad news that you didn't want to
hear?
It was sort of frustrating.
Yeah, yeah. Have any of you experienced a change of position? The initial discussion said, yeah, I guess you can do that as long as you get a variance, and the next discussion said, no, we're not going to recommend that at all. I mean, have you experienced that kind of change? I'm seeing you nodding, like.
No, I hear that from my clients all the time. It's like it turns more into a negotiation than clear guidelines defined by a conversation that takes place at one point.
Yeah.
Then renegotiations happen, and you end up having to readjust and lose a ton of money in the process.
Yeah. It's hard, especially you guys are doing the financial side of this too. and evaluating the time that's going to be required for entitlement, the risk of obtaining the entitlements that the project needs, and the money that you're going to have to put into the entitlements, that's a huge part of the evaluation of the feasibility of the project, right? So getting reliable information, getting the right answers, being able to rely on them, just a second, is going to be part of the entitlement process that you need to understand. And a lot of that will be understanding what the city's interests are. You have to be able to put yourself in the position of the regulator. You might or might not agree with them, but you have to see it through their eyes in order to persuade them, in order to get the information you need, but if you can't see it from their perspective, if they're just government obstructionists and you have that attitude going in, it ends pretty quickly. But what were you going to ask?
No, I had a client that was interested in a vacant golf course down in Broward, and the obstruction was really more from the residents. Because now that I guess they're using it as some type of a animal refuge, animal sanctuary, and it's a green space, and it wasn't so much, it was the opposition came from the people in the town.
Neighborhood,
And they formed their own Facebook page in opposition, and it just wasn't gonna be, it was too much to overcome, and so.
In developed areas that, like Broward, finding significant undeveloped land is a challenge. So converting golf courses, converting mobile home parks, those are some of the areas where you can put together a sizable assemblage of property, but you can encounter a lot of neighborhood opposition. And where the government lands on the neighborhood opposition can be, and we'll do an exercise near the end of the class where I give you a land development problem and I break you separate into interested parties. So some of you will be government staff, some of you will be the applicant, some of you will be neighborhood opposition, and you argue the case from that perspective, and then you're going to rotate and have to argue the case from the other perspective. Elected officials, even versus staff, can sometimes be quite different. So understanding what's driving the person that you're dealing with it's common sense, right, in human interactions, but it's going to be important in this too. Even though you're looking at a very well-developed code of regulations, that's just the starting point. It's nowhere near the final point. Okay, so back to a little bit of business about the class itself. Everybody was able to obtain the syllabus. I asked because every time I finish teaching this class, I completely forget how to use all of the systems of a university and how to use the email and how to sign in. And I'm like, did I really upload that syllabus correctly? So good, I'm glad you can find it. So you've got the nutshell. It's going to be fast reading. Any reading that you do in this business, in the industry, I think you'll find helpful. Signing up for ULI, I hope newsletters on different topics, I hope you're all doing that already. I will randomly, when I see one, circulate it to you and ask you to read it. This is the reading assignment, and this should be in the syllabus like this also. So, let's talk about the case study. The case study can be, the hardest thing about the case study is going to be finding the subject that you want to use as your case study. But it's like a 40% assignment for this class, so it's a big one. In the past, I've always done these in teams, in part because it can be hard to find this many subject matter to study that meet the criteria. But let me put it out there. Would you prefer to work independently because your life is so crazy that it's difficult to find time to collaborate with others, or would you like to work this case study in teams?
I think a team would be good.
Divide the work.
Get to know each other.
And then you're at the mercy of your teammates, and you know what I mean? I had good and bad experiences with that as a student, so.
Will the class have both options or one option?
I think that we're probably gonna settle on one option, and that is either teams or individual.
Teams
of how many?
They've been 3 to 4 in the past. What's the preference? Teams, who wants to work in teams?
Oh, perfect.
I think it's too early to make that decision now. I haven't even looked at the case study. So it's hard for me to make that call to say, I should work on a team for this assignment or not.
So let's talk about how you find a subject matter then. I want you to find a project that has gone through the local government development approval process to conclusion, either approval or denial. If it was rejected, that's a legitimate case study. The tricky part is identifying them, because I want them to include, I want your case study to study a project that included either a land use plan amendment or a rezoning. Sometimes they'll have both. So in Broward County, throughout Florida, really, comprehensive plans are mandatory, and all property has a comprehensive plan designation and generally a zoning. The reason that I want your case study to include either a rezoning or a comp plan amendment is that those decisions by local government are discretionary. There'll be a set of criteria under which they evaluate your request, but really it's the government getting to make up its own mind about the policies they want to, how they want their jurisdictional area to be developed. There are many things in land use that are code-based and they're linear. If you check off all the boxes, you will get approved. There's no doubt about it. Like a building code, if your plans meet the building code, you will get a building permit. There's really no discretion there. But land use plan amendments and rezonings are discretionary. And that's why I want you to find a project that includes one of those, so you can follow, these were the criteria, these were the justifications that the applicant provided to show that the rezoning or the land use plan amendment satisfied those criteria or advanced those policies. This was the way that the staff reviewed it. This is how the public hearings went. This is what the elected officials did. If just a site plan approval with no rezoning or no comp plan, again, can be very code-based. And the judgment, the discretion that's exercised in that review is much more limited. But it can be hard to find those projects. So there's a couple of ways to search for them. You can, for example, in Broward County, there is a county-wide land use plan. So and it's administered by the Broward County Planning Council. So if you start with their agenda, then you can go find the same project on a city agenda, and you can go find the information. Some of you may just read in the Real Deal or the South Florida Business Journal that somebody's project was just approved. You can grab onto the name of that project and you can start pulling that thread, figure out what jurisdiction, what processes it went through, and that can be the thing that will identify the project for you. If you've worked in a city or a county government, and you know even one planner that you've dealt with before, that you could pick up the phone, you're like, oh, my professor, she's killing me. I don't know how I'm gonna get this done. Help me out. Can you tell me what projects like yours that you've worked on that's come through your office include a rezoning or a comp plan amendment? Make a friend in government and see if they can steer you towards a project. Or it may be that you have an interest in a particular city. You'd like to understand how downtown Delray, Atlantic Avenue in Delray, how it developed the way it did. So that city is the focus, and you start looking at agendas on that city's website until you find one that meets the criteria. So these are the suggestions, but it can be time-consuming to look at agendas if that's the place that you end up searching, and to identify a project. So if we do teams, that reduces overall the number of projects that meet the criteria that you're going to have to find to study. I think it's another reason that we've done it in teams before. And we're gonna go through, we're gonna take some time to do that searching, and you can check, you can send me what you find about the project, and I'll have to review it, make sure that it meets the criteria, and approve the subject of the case study for you. Because I don't want you to get too far in and then realize that, I'm like, look, this didn't meet the criteria for the assignment, so.
Could it be a failed project?
No, it can be an approved project that got built, an approved project that never got built, or a failed project.
Could it be part of this currently?
Well, I'm gonna want you to, it's got to have gone through its final approval, because I want you to explain how they got there. I want you to be able to analyze how did they get to yes, or why did they end up at no.
We'll submit our request to you. What primary information do you want up front? Just the name of the project, or?
Send me the email and the name of the project, the jurisdiction where the approvals occurred, and then something like the final approval happened on a certain date, or something, so that I can go trace back the research you already did and confirm that the project meets the criteria. Yes.
What grading criteria or rubric are you going to use to grade the case study? Because the only thing I see is 40% of the final grade.
It is.
So what?
As we get closer, I'll provide more information, and I think I still have some case studies from the last time I taught this. You're going to do a presentation. You're going to have to use aerials, get the zoning map, the comprehensive land use plan, the future land use map, find the excerpts of those maps that include your subject area. You're going to need to get the staff reports that were prepared by each of the reviewing bodies. And then you're going to need to read some minutes. All these things are available as public records in Florida. So you're going to need to find the minutes of those meetings and read through them, and then summarize for us in your presentation what the project involved, what processes it went through, what changes were requested. It was a request from 20 acres of 5-unit per acre zoning to 10-unit per acre zoning, or whatever it was, and go through what the staff analysis led to and how the decision ultimately was made, what the steps were.
Thank you. So how are you going to grade each criteria? Are you going to give us that information later so that there's a uniform system of grading if we decide?
I don't know that I'll get that specific with you in the rubric. No, it's as we get closer, I'll go over those elements again, and I will create a rubric when you make your presentation and grade it, and I'll be looking for the elements that I've told you about. Okay.
So are we restricted to Florida or South Florida?
No, you're not. I'll say that if you stay in South Florida, you may have an easier time getting the information that you need. And as you go outside of Florida, I don't know what the public records laws are outside of Florida necessarily. So I don't, and I'll cover other states to some extent. Most of you, not all of you are living and working here, but Florida is a state that regulates land use pretty heavily. So it's a good way to learn your way around land use, and then if you end up in a state where land use is a little bit more lightly regulated, then you're way ahead of the game. But California, Oregon, Washington State, Florida, we're kind of the heavy-handed regulators of land use. And then you go to Texas and they have nothing at all. You can build anything you want anywhere in Texas, clearly.
When did they got rid of the DRI stuff, right? The whole.
Yes. Yep. The Development of Regional Impact Program. There are still those DRIs. Has anybody heard the term before? So a Development of Regional Impact is generally, in Florida, the creature statute is a very large scale, it was used for very large scale projects, or projects that were determined to affect more than one government jurisdiction. And it was like the precursor to real planning in Florida. When the project was large enough, then they forced you to conduct a whole lot of technical planning about your project. And it was overseen by regional planning councils, not just little city governments and so on. But as city and county governments became more competent in administering land use planning, the legislature has rolled back the DRI. So there are still existing DRIs that function under their development orders, but really no new DRIs anymore. So that's true. Any more like preliminary questions? Do you feel like you know enough about the case study assignment to start looking for your project? Okay. At some point today, I might do like a sample search up here through the Broward County Planning Council agenda to a particular project, and to give you an example of one way that you could search for them. But think about it. If you have more questions about how to find your case study project, raise them today as we go through. There will be a midterm. What I typically do is I distribute it by email, and it has to be completed. It's completed outside of class. It's open book, and you have to turn it around within 24 hours. That's probably how I will do the final exam also, but I'm going to kind of leave that open.
By open book, you mean this book?
Pardon?
You mean this book?
No, it'll be open. What I'll do is share the presentations with you after each class. At some point, I'll share presentations with you. The way I've done it before is a link to a Google Drive. Does that work for everybody? So the reading, the presentations, what we cover in class, basically, and your reading is what will be available to you. And actually, any research you can do to answer the questions will be available to you. It's open book. Go ahead.
Can you just remind me what DRI stands for again?
Development of Regional Impact.
Are the exams like multiple choice, short answers, essay format, or
Yes.
all of the above? Okay.
All of the above. Sometimes I have to say that I stop at short answer because I might not have time to read everything. Well, I don't know, I shouldn't put it that way. Again, it depends on how the class develops. Sometimes I'll, if you guys show signs that you excel at the writing and that will give you an opportunity to shine, I might give you more writing to do. But if writing is, as I get to know you, is torture for you, I might ask you to write less, and we'll stop with short answer. The point, because this is not a legal writing class, I have to remind myself, and it's not a writing class at all, but I hope that you do enough writing to where you understand how to write an essay, that you can write in complete sentences, and things like that, and unfortunately, it hasn't always been the case. So I'll share the presentations with you, but I see you guys all have books open, thank you. I know when I need to learn something and I'm listening to a lecture, I take handwritten notes because somehow that physical process helps me organize the material and retain more, even if I never look at the notes again. So it's old school, I know, but I believe in it, so I hope you do that. The grading scale is there. So we've done our introductions. And what I didn't ask, and some of you, if something comes to mind that you want to respond to, is there something specific that you hope to gain from this class? Get out with a grade, get out of the program because you're at the finish line. We can assume all of those things. But on a substantive, is there something like, I really hope that I learn fill in the blank. I really hope that I finally understand fill in the blank. Anything like that?
Rezoning.
What about?
In general, I think like parking, all of those stuff that developers usually have to deal with on the day-to-day. That's kind of the ones that we hear about.
By the time the plans get to you, they've been through it all, but kind of understanding how the plans get that.
Well, we're getting involved even earlier on in the process, so, you
Yeah.
know, they're always talking about, oh, we have to rezone this, and we have to wait for approval, so we have to do, our parking regulations now are less and less in some areas, but not in others. So I understand that.
Okay, anybody else?
And just more of an understanding of, say, for kind of like piggybacking on what he said, of seeing a parking lot and, you know, visualizing putting a building there, or, you know, a new retail center, what, I guess, goes into getting around those rezoning issues with land use.
What it takes to get from vacant to
Yeah,
built,
exactly.
basically, yeah.
Probably the flexibility of the bodies of government between city or county as far as how much they're willing to give and take.
Yeah. Has anybody worked on environmental matters in your career, in your work so far? Like getting environmental approvals?
Like remove it, like relocating residential and
Okay.
design suburbs.
So we'll spend some time with other agencies that have regulatory authority that are sort of adjacent to the land use. You know, they run sort of parallel until they collide. That you've got to contend with. Because it happens all the time that the requirements of the environmental regulations are actually prohibited by some other regulations. I got pulled into the tail end of a project on Fort Lauderdale Beach. It's called the Paramount. It's Electricon. Okay. So these people had paid a lot of money for their condos right on the beach, and they were all using the freight elevator because the Broward County elevator inspector wouldn't release the passenger elevators. And the problem was this: the city of Fort Lauderdale required that they have inside the elevator shaft repeaters for emergency radio systems. The Broward County elevator inspector said the code does not allow you to have anything inside an elevator shaft except elevator equipment. And I construe that those radio repeaters are not elevator equipment. Completely, diametrically in conflict, couldn't resolve. So they had to get a variance from the crazy Broward County elevator inspector's view of things in order to comply with the mandatory requirement of the city of Fort Lauderdale to get the elevators functioning again. That kind of stuff happens all the time. So we're going to study the environmental agencies, transportation agencies, environmental at both federal, state, local level, where you're going to encounter regulations that have to both be complied with. And they really don't care. You know, city, municipal, zoning plan, they don't care what else you have to satisfy. It's their code you have to meet. So we'll do some of that too.
Not to go down a rabbit hole, but in a situation like that, isn't that, don't the elevator people get their directive from the city, or is that like, I can understand state and local conflicting, but that seems like both local requirements.
Now, in Broward County had a delegation of authority to administer the entire state level of elevator inspection program. So Broward County was large and in charge on elevators, and the city had the experience of firefighters being unable to get radio reception in tall towers. So they were large and in charge in terms of emergency radio reception. So and I found an expert who said the Broward County elevator inspector does not have to apply the code in that way. If it allows, you know, he said, but no one had been able to get him off that position. He wanted you to process variances, so they had to process 7 variances with several $1,000s of application fees for each one of them to get the stupid elevators. It's like, it didn't change anything.
So you need a variance from the law to comply with the law.
Yes, you needed a variance of one law to comply with the other law.
Did that rewrite the original? No?
No, it doesn't change anything for the next guy coming along. They're in exactly the same position.
But in finding your case, can you use that previous as reference?
You can, but you know what? You gotta pay somebody like me a whole lot of money to find the case and make the argument and make the application. It's kind of crazy, but there are those agencies, again, that they are not directly involved in land use regulations. School boards. Okay, school boards have a lot to say now about adding residential density because they have the constitutional obligation to build and provide adequate schools. So they've gotten in the land use regulatory business. When I started in this industry, the school board had nothing to say about this, except building their own. They got an exemption from the law to build their own schools the way they wanted to. But where cities and counties permitted increased residential density and created therefore students, the school board didn't pay any attention. They just came along behind and said, gee, maybe we need another school over there.
Question. If the construction of a school impedes traffic, and it just ruins the entire ergonomics of the streets, does that have to do anything with zoning? Because you just said schools have.
You know, it can. In Florida, school boards can assert that they're not subject to local zoning. Most of the time, they work cooperatively. They sort of subject themselves to the land use regulations for that reason, because they want to have say in the zoning decisions. So therefore, they allow the zoning regulatory authority to have a say in their site location decisions. So they've figured out, at least in Broward and around most of Florida, that they need to work more cooperatively than maybe their constitutional mandates would say requires them.
The only reason I ask is because in the area I live in, there's 3 schools that have gone up in 4 years. Every time the schools are open, it's a huge. It's an incredible gridlock.
Yeah.
It's like 4 or 5 hours in the middle of nowhere. Like they're in the middle of traffic, and you can't move because of these kids driving.
How long does it go on? The gridlock?
The gridlock goes on for like 4 hours.
No.
From the entire school zone time to after that, because it's a high school, a middle school, and a pre-K.
Yeah.
You say gridlock goes for 4 hours, you mean like you're stuck in traffic for 4 hours?
You're stuck there waiting for your kid to be picked up for 4 hours, 3.5 hours easily.
Wow, that brings up a whole series of why do kids always have to get dropped off and picked up? There's like a whole social discussion behind that. But again, schools are sort of an adjacent. The FDOT, environmental agencies, school boards. I'm trying to think of other agencies that can have an impact on this. So they're not directly involved in land use approval, but you encounter them and you have to overcome them or satisfy them or co-opt them, bring them in the tent of your project. So we'll cover some of those too. We'll work through those agencies. Okay. So I think even what little bit I'm learning about you all so far, I think you probably know the value of understanding land use law to some extent. But you know, some of the things that you'll gain from this class will contribute to, I think it'll work synergistically with what you're learning in the rest of the program. How the development potential contributes to land value. So if you were looking at a blank piece of property, you would need to, in order to determine the price, an appropriate price to pay for it, you'd need to figure out what you can build there, you know, what you can develop there, and then you can project the cost of that development and the income that it will produce or the profit that will be shown on a sale. But the baseline is you have to figure out with some reasonable certainty what can be built there. And that's what contributes to the value of the land. And understanding the social, political, and legal implications of real estate ownership and development. If you had a chance to read those first couple of chapters, you know, it gave a little bit of history about how land use has been regulated historically and even in other parts of the world. In some parts of the world, the assumption is you can do nothing until the government tells you that you can. There's no inherent, the lawyer will know this, you know, bundle of sticks of rights that come with land ownership. In other places, including the U.S., because of the colonial history, there's a belief, there's a deep-seated belief in our political system that when you own land, you have the right to do what you want with it, unless government can justify some restraint on that right. And that's really what we find ourselves dealing with in most parts of the U.S. now. It's like a property owner has total full control over what can be done on that land from the sky to the center of the earth unless they sell it, or they sell a part of those rights, or they convey them to someone else and agree to share them, or the government can justify the regulation of those rights. And that's where we find ourselves most of the time in land use here in the US. But understanding that premise is a good starting point. Then the political, there are a lot of political considerations always with land development approval. And land development approval is the most local kind of government regulation you can imagine. A project could come through at a time when, for example, school capacity is the hottest issue that in that town at that moment in time. So adding residential density is the, oh my God, we can't approve that. Whereas if it came through 2 years later, after the school overcrowding had been resolved, that wouldn't be the hot button issue at all. But when you're planning a project, you need to understand what the political setting is that you're going to be proposing the project in. After a hurricane, evacuation, flooding, how fast you can get building permits to repair, whether you're going to be able to put that mobile home park back or not, those are the hot button issues in a town right after a hurricane comes through. If there's been no hurricane in 10 years, nobody really cares about those things so much. So you really have to understand the political context of a development proposal. You need to develop a realistic expectation of the time and expense required to obtain development approvals. This, because time is money, right? If it takes you 6 months to get from application to final approval, and then it's going to take you another 3 months to get your building plans approved, that's different than taking 18, in terms of your cost analysis of the project. If it's going to take you 18 months to get to the point where you can submit for a building permit, wholly different kind of financial analysis. So you need to be realistic about that. Some of the, and I'm touching on here, one of the things that's going to drive a schedule for a project is the workload of the different disciplines involved in your team. So if you're a developer, you're going to need to hire a land planner, a surveyor, a civil engineer, a land use lawyer, and and then the architect, right? Every time you submit to a local government, you're going to get a set of comments. You're going to have to review the comments, respond to all of them, revise the plans, and resubmit them. Every one of those turnarounds is going to drive your schedule. So if you're working with the best engineer in that city, and you're so glad that you finally got her on your team because she knows everybody, but she's so busy that she can't get to your project, it's going to affect your schedule. So you've got to understand the way that that your team needs to work together to evaluate the timing of your project. Understand the effect of land use planning and development systems on the local tax base. Okay. So somebody tell me, what is the effect on real property taxes of development?
Would be the impact fees?
Oh, it's,
Impact fees, if a project gets approved and built, a new project, the city can collect impact fees. That's one, that's not the property tax, but that's one revenue source. What else?
well, I was just gonna say that, I mean, especially if it's vacant property, I mean, that's a tax that they would collect, that they weren't collecting before, so that's the incentive for the.
So the taxable value of the property will increase when it's developed. So
Yes.
that's the basic thing. An improved property is going to generate more tax revenue than an unimproved property. What about on the negative side? What about on the other side of that equation? What's the impact of development on the costs of the local government?
The use of the resources for the city, like fire, increased firemen use, increased water from this going through to that particular place. Just costs, basic costs for the city, roads being redone and stuff like that.
To provide services, basic city services have to be extended to the property. Yep, those are the basics. And in some cities, they're development friendly, they have confidence in the baseline in their plan, you're developing according to the plan, they're not overly worried about those calculations. Some cities that are development and revenue hungry, they really want you to show. It's like, what are you adding to our community with this? And you always have to analyze the impact on facilities, but some of them you're going to need to show the other side. You know, when I finish my $20 million project, it's going to add this much to your bottom line in property tax revenue every year. You might have to put that on the scale to get their support for the project. Identify the stakeholders in the development approval process and learn how to work with them. Who are the stakeholders?
Everyone, everybody.
Go ahead.
Well, the local residents for one. Community.
The nearby residents,
Nearby
yeah.
residents.
Anyone's who's impacted by it, so it could be.
And anyone who's impacted by it. Anyone else? The elected officials, stakeholders, yeah. What?
Investors, developers.
Yes, yes. People looking for jobs. It's sort of a different constituency. That if you're putting a retail center in, yes, you're using the resources of the city. Yes, you're gonna, affect the tree canopy of the city, but you know what? You're gonna provide jobs for a lot of people in a community. When one of the projects I worked on was Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital in Hollywood. Were you a Calvin Giordano or something? What?
No, Charlie did the entitlements for that.
Yeah, I worked with, yes,
yeah.
I did. Yes, we worked very closely on that. I did with a former partner at the firm, we did the rezoning and the site development plan for Joe DiMaggio. And the city, the neighborhood opposed that project in a way that blew my mind. They felt like the hospital kept expanding, secretly buying houses, which they did, to prepare themselves for expansion. And the neighborhood was just like, stop the hospital, stop the hospital. And it got very ugly. It's a public hospital, so they stood up and complained at the public hearings about those people coming to their neighborhood to go to that public hospital. It was really ugly. But the city was very, very supportive. And you know what? It was, 2009 or something, 2010. It was the middle of the downturn. And this was the only project happening in the city. This was going to feed local businesses. It was going to create more jobs. The city was so supportive, but still, we had 2 public hearings until 3 o'clock in the morning on that approval. And the actual doctors and nurses, the whole staff of that hospital stayed until 3 o'clock in the morning to testify about the need for the hospital, which is something I had never experienced in my life. So it was, the stakeholders were different. At that point in time, the need for economic development and the need for job creation in the city of Hollywood drove the commissioners to support the project, even though the electorate, a very vocal subset of voters, opposed the project. That's what tipped the balance for the city at that time. So understand the legislative, quasi-judicial, and judicial processes. How many of you have ever heard the term quasi-judicial? Familiar with it, okay. So there are many different decision points through a land development process. Some of them are administrative. If you check all the boxes, you get the permit. Some of them require discretion at a staff level. Some of them require approval by elected officials at public hearings. So we're going to learn more about each of these kind of decisions and how that affects your approval process. And what the appeal mechanism. If you are denied and you think it's unfair or it was unjustified, what can you do about it? Each of those different types of decisions can lead to a different appeal process. And you'll work with a lawyer, but you'll need to understand it a little bit because you're going to have to prepare the presentation of the case, the project differently, depending on what the appellate mechanism is. Because you need to create records. So you'll work with a lawyer. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand it, but some understanding of those different pathways to a decision will be helpful for you as you start developing your projects. So some of the ethical issues associated with real estate development. So just give me your sort of off-the-cuff reaction to this scenario. You want to build a condominium tower. You're gonna demolish a low-scale motel on the beach and build a condominium tower. And it'll be roughly the same size as all the other towers along the beach, very similar. But the condominium next door is opposing it because they have theirs, they don't want anybody else to have what they have, or they think it's going to affect their views or whatever they think. And the condominium association meets with you and you present the project to them and say, isn't this great? We're going to get rid of this junky little motel that's been here forever, and we're going to have this beautiful project. We would like your support. And eventually you hear from the condo association, sure, but we'd like you to spend $120,000 repainting our pool deck. And then we can support you. How does that strike you? Ethical? Unethical?
Unethical. I mean, you're taking this work, you don't have a right to abuse it.
Well, so just, again, a few of you, what did you think?
Unethical. First off, it's the same height, size of the prior motel. That I don't see how that would obstruct their view, but also, for financial gain, they want their pool deck painted in exchange for their approval.
Unethical for them to ask, or unethical for you to pay?
For them to ask, they initiate this.
Okay, so let me change the facts a little bit. During your construction, it's reasonable to assume that materials could fly, and dirt, and paint, and could actually damage their pool deck. So really, you're just mitigating the impact of your construction. Still unethical?
Yes.
Until it occurs.
You work it into after the fact. All right, we'll finish construction and then we gotta assess and pay for it to be painted.
That's like curveballs, like, hey, we're gonna do this for the next 18 months, and we know stuff's gonna happen to your deck, so we'll do it after we're done with our building.
Yeah.
After the fact.
So that seems, there's a reasonable connection between
Negotiation.
for the ask. Okay, what if, let's roll it back, we're in the meeting with the condominium association, and their ask is, we'd like you to commit that this will be condominium ownership only and no rental. We don't like renters. That's not who we want in our neighborhood.
That's unethical. When you asking if it's ethical or unethical?
Yeah.
Unethical.
You think that ethical, unethical. So there's,
what's the question again?
so what the condo wants in exchange for their support is that you promise to only have a for sale condo project, no rentals.
I think it's asked, but I don't think it's implied.
Can't you just put it in the bylaws?
Well, whether you can enforce it or not is a different thing. Sometimes they want no kids. Whether you can enforce that under federal law is a different thing.
Doesn't the city have a say on that, where you can rent in an apartment building on that facility?
No, actually, they
How
cannot.
about the Airbnb thing that happened?
Well, they are still fighting over it. But the city cannot prevent you from, they cannot dictate the method of ownership. They think they can, and sometimes you agree to things, again, to get support, but it's really not enforceable.
In a case like that, when you try to find out why they actually prefer to have condominiums as opposed to rentals, because if you have high-end rentals and you have condominiums, they kind of equate.
No, because renters are renting what renters, and renters do not care about what they have. They're gonna, any renter, whether it's someone making $50 an hour or only making $500 an hour, is always gonna destroy that apartment.
That's a matter of opinion.
That's an interest, okay, that's been based on your experience as property manager, right? Okay, as more and more high-end rentals go up around Broward County, I would probably say that the makeup of those renters is not the same as the renters that you've been dealing with. So it can vary. But those are the kind of ethical questions that you're going to encounter. It could be election season, and elected officials invite you to fundraising events. And you'll confer with council, but there is not, as long as there's not a quid pro quo of, I give you $10,000, you give me your vote. There's probably not a violation of the law, but there's a lot that can happen short of that can smell really bad.
In the book, it talked a little bit about something, and I wanted to ask about it. It said that as a lawyer, if you represented, let's say, Broward County was your client at one time, zoning department, right? And then you don't work for Broward County anymore, and now you go and you work for a developer that wants to do a project in Broward County, that would be, you probably would have to recuse yourself because conflict of interest.
It depends. It depends on the time period. Okay. If I just resigned from Broward County and I want to take on a client and appear in front of that board, there's usually a blackout period by ordinance that you can't appear before the board that you represented for a period of time. That's true with the state legislature too. So usually there's like a year, 2 years, depending on how high your position was with the government sometimes, that you're prevented from appearing before them. And then the rest of it is a matter of explaining the conflict to your client, if the conflict still exists, and seeing if the two parties will waive it. Certain things are waivable. But really, moving from government into private practice, there's usually just a down period, a dark period, when you can't go back and represent them. And you can never, as a lawyer, use confidential information that you have from a prior representation. You can't disclose it. That goes on forever. So let's say, when I left Broward County, I was the construction lawyer for the airport expansion program. But when I went into private practice, I started working on land use matters. So I hopped right into Broward County and worked on land use matters because it wasn't something I had been working on when I left Broward County's employment, and I wasn't bound by any sort of blackout period. So I wasn't using any confidential information, and I wasn't subject to a blackout period. That sort of thing. So, but it's something that yes, we have to be aware of. And as a developer hiring a land use lawyer, you want someone who's close to that government agency, who maybe they worked there previously, maybe they just still have good. You want good relationships. Relationships make a difference in these scenarios. And sometimes it's as simple as the government staff knows that you can be trusted. They have some history with you, and that you understand what they need, and you've got their back, and they can trust you. So, okay. So ethical. Is that last? Develop an understanding of the scope of expertise of the members of the development team: developer, lawyer, lobbyist, engineer, traffic engineer, surveyor. Okay. So this is, some of you who work in the industry know this stuff already, but to really understand what each of these players does on the team is important, because if you are halfway through an entitlement process and realize that you need a civil engineer to do a drainage plan and it hadn't occurred to you yet, you're going to lose so much time. The whole design of your project is going to be different if nobody really planned the drainage adequately. Surveyors and lawyers. Sometimes you're going to redevelop a project that has an existing drainage system, and the drainage ponds outfall into a publicly owned drainage canal. And everybody assumes there must be an easement, there must be a legal right to entitle that water to flow. You know what? There isn't always. And once you start changing it, it becomes clear that that property never had a right to drain into that canal to begin with. And the land that you have to cross with your drainage, you don't own it. You don't have any right to demand a drainage easement across that adjacent land. But your whole project was designed on the premise that you would be able to continue the drainage that had been in existence without legal right for however many years have been going on. Though you need a good surveyor, and you need, surveyors tend to think that they're lawyers. So you need your surveyor to work with a lawyer to understand if you need rights outside of the perimeter of your project. Do you really have them? How are you going to get them? So those aspects of understanding the disciplines, each of the disciplines on your team, becomes very important, because the sooner you recognize the need for that expertise, the better off you are. You can incorporate that work into your project plan from the beginning.
I mean, if your engineers and all that haven't done their thing, you might not know what you need. It might be too late when you find out. Is that possible?
Things pop up, okay? A partner of mine worked on a project that drainage rights were going to be needed, you know, and an engineer can calculate how many cubic whatever you need of drainage. So the engineer or the surveyor said, oh, there's this lake down the block. You can buy drainage rights in that lake. And the client bought the drainage rights. They didn't have a way to get there. They couldn't acquire the rights to get there. They ended up suing the surveyor and delaying their project. It's been 8 years now.
They sued the surveyor because he told them they could use that?
Yes.
But he didn't tell them how to get there?
No. So you need to understand what each of those players on the team is capable of doing for you and what they can't, and get the right people on the team. And you know, with a small redevelopment project where you're taking down a 4,000 square foot building and you're putting up another one, you might not need a traffic analysis at all, because it's 4,000 of this and 4,000 of the same thing. What's the difference? But you need to know before you make the investment in that property whether a traffic analysis is going to be required, and really, what's it going to show? How deep a hole is this traffic analysis going to put me in before you pay the price? Experience a public hearing before you find yourself at the podium with your client's property at stake. So we're going to, this exercise that I talked about, we're going to sort of play act some public hearing scenarios. If I can identify a project that's interesting, that's going to have a public hearing during the time period that we're doing this class, it takes a long time for them to get to their public hearings. It's very hard to anticipate when the public hearing will be. And again, maybe you can tell us, what's your name again? Erin.
Erin, yeah.
That, you know, there's a project that's going to have its final public hearing in the next 2 months, and those of you who are available can go and watch the public hearing. And you can pull up video recordings of public hearings to get a sense of how the process goes. Some local governments are extremely formal, and some of them are not. So knowing what you're walking into makes all the difference in the world. Sometimes some local governments, when you're the applicant on the agenda, of course you're going to speak. You don't have to disclose, you don't have to fill out a card to speak, you're the applicant. Some cities, not so. Even if you're the applicant, if you don't fill out a card and give it to the city clerk before the hearing starts, you're not allowed to speak. It's crazy, right? But you need to know what the rules are before you walk into the public hearing.
My undergraduate professor calls that the Super Bowl of land development, is making it to city council final. It's like the ultimate.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some hearings that, you know, the preparation was enormous, and the decision happened in 15 minutes. Some of them I never had to get out of my chair, but the preparation, all mattered. So, yeah, it is. Okay. All right, questions so far about the scope of what we're going to be looking at here? No? Okay. So each of you, what I hope is that you each become familiar with the lingo. There's a lot of lingo in this business, and it changes from one local government to another. How many times you're going to wish, why isn't there one zoning code with one set of definitions, and they all use the same ones? Wouldn't that make more sense? But it doesn't make any sense. Each local government is unique. The way they choose to regulate development in their community, they think is completely unique. And they're the most important, and they're the most important for you on that day. What they want matters more than anything else at that given time. So you need to learn the lingo, you need to learn, some of you probably speak multiple languages, you know, so you need to translate. It's like, oh, I get it, the PUD in this city is just like the PD in that other city. Oh, you need whatever, the innovative design, you know, innovative design category is the same thing as PD in this other city. So you make those translations in your head, but you have to learn the lingo and keep the big picture in mind. So even, we're already down in the weeds here a little bit, right? Talking about the details of getting a particular project approved by a particular local government with a particular set of requirements. But don't lose sight of the bigger picture, that what these projects do has an impact on quality of life in that community. It might be the community that you live in. It's the community that you want to sell the project to. You know, you want users of that project to experience a better quality of life. It's creating places that people remember that are like downtown Delray, okay? That was a 20-year process of eliminating blight in downtown Delray Beach, and now it's held up around the country as a successful downtown redevelopment. It's a place people remember, and it's created a character for that city. Creating linkages. So what does this mean? So understanding a project doesn't exist in isolation. You mentioned the impact of schools, you know, 3 schools letting out within the same 2-hour period. Every project has affects a community in multiple ways. Traffic, water and sewer demand, loss of tree canopy, loss of other kinds of green space, the enhancement of pedestrian activity and the health benefits that provides, or the inhibition of pedestrian connectivity and the effect that has on public health. The design of a residential project can either aid in people aging in place, or it can inhibit the ability of people to age in place in their own home and cause people as they age to have to move out. So do you want, those are the linkages I'm talking about. Big community public policy kind of impacts. Don't lose sight of them, because it's your career, and you want to look back on your career and know that what you did had lasting value for the communities that you worked in. Future generations, establish a vision, reinvent the community. So all of these things are in the background all the time, and they'll contribute to the value of the project. They'll help you win approval for the project to show that you've thought these things through, and that a project is going to improve the quality of life in the community. Okay. Basis of authority. When do you guys want to take a break? We're here until 5?
30.
We're supposed supposed to be?
Yeah, 5, we'll be good.
Whatever you want us to do.
Five is a good number. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going a little bit because let's get through this.
Yeah.
Through there. Okay, so if you've done some of your reading, some of this will be familiar to you. The basis of land use authority. We talked a little bit about that. Does the society start from a position of an owner can do anything they want with their land, or start from a position of an owner can do nothing with their land until they're given approval? That guides this discussion to some extent. But there's a sort of unique basis for land use regulation that you might not encounter anywhere else. And it had its start in nuisance law, but let me see if I can get to that point. So these are some of the questions that are going on behind the concept of land use regulation. What does it mean to own land? Should full enjoyment of private property always be permitted? What are the constraints? If it's going to be constrained in any way, what can those constraints be? Who should have the final say? Should it be government closest to the residents? Should it be the federal government because it's unaffected by, little parochial concerns that will keep the greater good in mind? Should it be completely market-based? Okay, there's really no need for regulation because you're only going to build in an open and free market something that is beneficial to the community because that's the only thing that'll turn a profit. You think that market-based, no government regulation, is that a reasonable way to do this? You wish. But that could be a legitimate approach to land development, is let the market, and in reality I think Houston has more regulations now than they used to, but they have no zoning code. And to some extent, they believe in letting the market drive it.
So wait, sorry. So if there's not a zoning code, you can build a garage next to a house?
It's funny, I did a diligence on a project for an investor or buyer, I can't remember, in Houston. And although they don't have something called a zoning code, as we get into the nitty-gritty of what is in a zoning code, what kind of things are regulated, they just find another way to regulate it through the subdivision code or the drainage regulations or the landscape regulations. They just didn't have something called a zoning code. So they end up regulating all the same things by calling it something else. So, and when does land use regulation go too far? If you owned 10 acres and someone said, yeah, you used to be able to put 5 houses on that, but we're going to change the law so you can only put 1 house on it now. Is that going too far?
Yeah.
Yeah?
It depends on what's in the area.
What?
I said, it depends on what's in the area. If all the houses are on 10 acres of land, then.
So it doesn't depend how much money you lose on the value of your property. It only depends on the neighborhood concerns or the neighborhood compatibility?
I think if they're paying the same amount of money for 10 acres, does it really matter?
Well, when I bought the land, I could have put 5 houses there, and then you changed the rules on me, and I could only put 1. I paid a price that contemplated, subdivision of 5. But so you've now destroyed the value of my property.
Don't you have to do like historical data for that?
Well, let's see.
So let's say somebody gets started, like on that example you stated, if someone already started construction on 5 homes on 1 lot, they're grandfathered into the old rule if they change it the next day, correct?
That rule, that changes in every single jurisdiction. Every jurisdiction will have in their code non-conforming uses. That is, and they have different standards. Does the use exist? Has it existed continuously, or do they hang their hat on whether a permit was issued? Those can change. There comes a point when federal, and we'll do some cursory discussion of federal takings law, when the government, the courts would say, you know what, you've gone too far. You have taken their property without due process and without compensation. Not a valid action. But when you reach that point, where that point is with each individual set of facts, nobody really knows. It changes all the time. There's a question of whether, has anybody ever had to have an appraisal done or read an appraisal? Yeah, you've read an appraisal. So what is what's the conclusion of an appraiser? What the value is given the highest and best use is typically, right? Is everyone entitled to achieve the highest and best use for their property? Should they be?
I think so. No.
What do you think?
No.
No?
No.
No entitlement to highest and best use?
No.
So what should the property owner be entitled to as a minimum? How would you describe it?
Like the happiness, like proper use of the property, and also like has to be like a I don't know what the words they use in this first chapter, but it has to be, you have to be happy with your land or something like that.
Happiness. You're entitled to happiness. Okay. What was that?
Should be able,
No, I read it here.
should be able to use your property to the fullest extent you can that doesn't affect
Detriment
other
of
people.
others.
Okay. Highest and best use to the extent you don't harm anyone else.
Yes.
Right. Under the law in your area.
Okay. Any other views on this? What should you be able to use your land for? Should it matter that when you bought the land, it was a swamp, but if you fill the land, you can build on it? Are you entitled to fill it because the science and the money exists to fill it and build, or are you stuck with the swamp because you bought a swamp? You shouldn't be entitled to anything else.
You might be stuck with a swamp if it affects the environment by filling it. You know, that means it hurts, it harms the greater good.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so how much harm? A little bit of harm or a lot of harm?
Whatever the law says you're allowed to do.
So what if the harm is to a species that only nests there 1 month out of the year?
Maybe it's an invasive species.
It's not invasive, it's not.
Then you shouldn't have bought that land.
Because no, I don't mean that.
You should do due diligence.
Due diligence. You should have done some due diligence of what's.
Now you can go
living
bird
there.
watching 1 month
Do
of
an
the year.
environmental assessment to figure out if you had those kind of species on the
Yes.
land. I unfortunately, early in my private practice career, I heard these words come out of a client's mouth when I told him that there were burrowing owls. He said, "Oh, that's not a problem." I said, "What do you mean it's not a problem?" He goes, "Nothing that an evening tennis game can't resolve."
Oh my Wow.
I'm like, "Don't say that to me, don't say that to me."
I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if this is relevant. I've heard a story about Terry Styles' property that he was trying to build on for his house. I think it was Blue Vista. And they found bones and remains. The conclusion was it was they had to stop construction. And it was like ancient burial ground.
Oh,
They
wow.
couldn't build on it anymore. It was fully stopped.
Nope, diligence to find those things before you make the investment is certainly better, but sometimes you find them anyway. I live off Pine Island Road. Does anybody remember when they had a section of Pine Island Road just west of the golf course, like marked off because they found like 3,000-year-old Tequesta remains there, and the Native American tribe is long gone. They ended up going to another Native American tribe and asking them, "What do you think we should do with these remains?" And they left them in place and repaved the road right on top of her. They determined that it was like an adolescent female. And every time I leave my development, I drive over her. But you know,
Oh, jeez.
but that was a public project. So again, this is a rabbit hole story. But when I was with Broward County, I was sitting with a board that was going to select a consulting archaeologist to do surveys of publicly owned lands to find archaeological sites. And I ended up asking one representative of one of the firms, you know, and how many PhDs do you have, you know, of your staff in your firm? And he goes, well, I got one in my truck now. I'm like, a PhD in your truck? He goes, oh, he goes, I thought you meant post-hole digger. It was just a good moment. It didn't have that many in government. Okay, so the definition for an appraiser is the highest and best use. The reasonably probable and legal use of vacant land or an improved property that is physically possible, legally permissible, appropriately supported, financially feasible, and that results in the highest value. Okay, there's a lot of wiggle room in there, right? Vacant land or improved land. So physically possible. So what's physically possible is going to depend on what the soil can support in terms of foundation. What are some of the other standards that would come into play in determining what's physically possible?
Structural, topography?
Yes, yeah, topography, those kind of things. Legally permissible, that's what we're talking about. It may be legally permissible if you persuade the local government to modify the legal regulations that apply by rezoning or comprehensive plan amendment. But an appraiser, in determining highest and best value based on highest and best use, will say that that legally permissible, it can be modified, but that's got to be reasonable and not speculative. Or they're not going to take into account that you could rezone it or upzone it. But they might take into account that, you know what, everybody around you has gotten an upzoning. It's reasonable to assume that you can too. So they might give effect to that kind of rezoning. So not only what's legally permissible at the time of the appraisal, but what could reasonably be obtained without undue speculation. Appropriately supported. Supported by what? Appropriately supported. Well, what does that mean?
Shareholders?
I think this is a reference to infrastructure. Is there public right-of-way? Are there roads available? Is there water and sewer capacity? Are the water and sewer lines adjacent to the property? Are they going to have to be extended? Those kind of things. Let's say the local government now requires that you have reuse water available. Okay, how far away is the reuse water line if that's what's going to be required before you can build? I think those are the reference, is what appropriately supported means by facilities and services. So financially feasible. You guys are studying some of that now. So what makes a project financially feasible? What are some of the criteria? What are some of the considerations, let's say?
Capital.
Capital, initial capital, availability of capital. What else?
Land.
That the land is
Need a location.
is available. So what else?
The ability of the project to make more money than it actually costs to build.
Okay, what goes into that? What do you have to analyze to reach that conclusion?
Demographics, well,
Yeah.
town.
Market.
Yeah.
Saturation,
Comparables.
market saturation for the use. Construction costs. Associated with capital is the cost of obtaining the capital. Okay, if the lending market is changing significantly, those costs could change. So all of those things will go into determining financial feasibility. And the time and the cost of obtaining the entitlements is going to come in there too, because it could be that 18 months you win, 24 months you lose. And I've seen that happen to clients too, fumbling around with, you know, a small industrial park in a certain quadrant of the county, and then, you know, lo and behold, Prologis comes and pops out of the ground down the street, and their market is just saturated. So, and then they ended up walking away because the timing, they didn't hit the market. They were not able to hit the market at the right time. So some related topics. We talked about when does regulation go too far? That's a discussion of regulatory takings. When a regulation is so burdensome that it results in the loss of substantially all the value or the reasonable use of the property, and those are all difficult things to define, it can result in a regulatory taking. Now, to contrast to that, government can acquire land when it wants to. Eminent domain. Has anybody had any experience with eminent domain at all, or the concept of it?
Just like at that taking, like, right away.
That's when the government says,
It wasn't the right way to
yeah.
for it, so.
So the government says, we need to build a government facility. We need to extend a road. We need to put in a water plant. We need to build a school even. Or we need more parks. So we're going to buy the property from the private property owners. But the private property owners don't really have a choice. The government takes the land.
You can't beat it.
In Florida is very, very protective of private property rights. So in other states, the private property owner can be in a worse position than they might be in Florida. So the government has to announce the project and say we're going to take this land for this project, and the project has to have a public purpose. And then they go through a judicial proceeding to buy that land under this forced mechanism, and they have to pay fair compensation for it. The U.S. Constitution and the Florida Constitution have a slightly different standard for that. But and in Florida, they pay all the expenses for the property owner. The condemning authority does. Ultimately, the property owner, the only way they can prevent it is in court on what's called an order of taking to convince a judge that there's really no proper public purpose for the project. And it just doesn't happen very often. And there's a lot of procedural protection for the property owner under statute in Florida. So that's the most extreme form of land use action that government can take, right? They're not talking about you can use it, this is what you can use it for, this is what you can't use it for. They're saying, we're just going to take the property. It's going to become our property, the government's property, so we ultimately decide what's done on that property. That's the far right end of land use, government taking. And then we have regulatory takings, where the government tries to regulate the land and they're so heavy-handed with it that a judge eventually determines that the regulations constitute a taking. And then we have zoning that we've been talking about. It's the next thing on that continuum, where the government says, we're going to give you a range within which you can develop your property. Zoning regulations. Here's a list of uses that you can build here. And here's a list of criteria. So that's the next thing on the continuum of take the land, regulate it so heavily that you effectively take the land, or regulate the land in a way that you attempt to be reasonable if you've got a range of uses. And then there's a related topic of just planning in general. As a result of urban development, the field of planning became a separate area of expertise. And that now affects all of these decisions when, for decades really, the high-level planning policy implications were not really considered. It was like the elected officials on a given day, you asked them to put a supermarket there and they said yes or no, and nobody looked at the overall planning considerations. But now planners and their analysis and their opinions are a big part of this process. So why should governments intervene in land use markets at all? Why do you think local government should regulate the use of land? What are the things that say, yeah, local government should have something to say about this?
So you don't get sin uses near a school district? Or
You don't get what?
like sin uses near a school district? Or
Okay, so you don't have incompatible land uses next to each other. That's a reason. All right, what are some other reasons that local government should be in this business?
Population growth, if you, as the population grows and you have land uses all over the place, it should be orderly to help the population grow out and the land be used adequately.
So to accommodate population growth or to prevent it?
To accommodate it.
Okay. What are some other reasons that local government should be in this regulatory business?
Because, you know, the people who have the project are concerned about the project, but the local government, someone needs to look out for the entire place, entire city or municipality or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And to make sure that whatever is being done fits within their plan.
So the interest of the many is balanced against the interest of the few.
So I was just, before here, I was posted in Malta over in Europe. And they have, Malta's an old place. And a lot of the buildings look the same. They have this nice tan look to them, the old style. And then someone went and built this tower, this huge blue, it's the ugliest thing you ever want to see. And I think it looked really, it wouldn't look out of place in Fort Lauderdale or Miami. Not saying it would look great there. It would look great there. Because it's all glass and steel and everything. But in Malta, everything looks, you know, sandstone, and it's like, you know.
Yeah.
And this thing, it's just ruins the skyline. And I mean, people there just, every time they see it, they hate it. They like to put a big curtain around it. And it's that, and if the government were really on their, you know, looking out, they wouldn't have let that happen.
So the government there didn't look out for the interests of the community as a whole.
I would say that yes.
To what extent do you think land use regulation should be concerned with design, beauty?
I was gonna say.
Or is it just function? Like, you know, an ugly 10-unit apartment building is fine just as well as a beautiful 10-unit. It's like, do you think government should have anything to say about aesthetics in land use regulation? Do you have that on the
Yes. I think there was a company some years back that built these two pre-planned cities. One was in Columbia, Maryland, one was in West Virginia. And basically just designed the entire city, and everything was, from every bush to every building was designed with a certain look like that. If they wanted all sandstone or a certain look, because that affects the value of the neighboring property. So they wanted one kind of uniform look and feel of the community. So, and if you know that going in, you know that's what you. If you want some live in a community that just buildings going up haphazardly and you get this mishmash of different looks, then I guess. But I think if that's what you're looking for, I think that they do it a role to keep it that way. Like HOAs have they have certain covenants and restrictions that require. Some require you to paint your house. You'll have to be a tan or some variation thereof. Other communities, I don't care if it's purple, blue, green, black, whatever. You know, they want your grass regulated. They want all the lawns mowed a certain time and everything. So there's a certain look that they're looking for. I think that could be.
So do you think that's a legitimate government purpose to achieve a look for the community? Yeah, you do? Yeah. Anybody disagree with that? You're shaking your head.
I think it's great for a city, like the city of Coral Gables wants everything to, I mean not everything, but the majority of buildings downtown, they want to retain that old Spanish vibe. Sure, that's great, that's a city problem. But for the city of Miami, no. I mean, you want to put up a skyscraper, as long as it's within code.
Yeah.
So for certain cities, I understand it, but I think it's a city-wide issue, like I think it's a city problem.
Yeah, not a
like
one of my partners is also an architect, and he fought the city of Coral Gables to put a metal roof on his house.
It's a nightmare.
For years.
Oh God.
And lost.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, he will lose.
He did.
Like everybody has to have a garage. It's
House
just
is a single family home.
It was just his home. You know, as an architect, like he knew the value. The value of it. I mean, there's an initial higher cost, but you know, then they last. Architect student, you know, they last so much longer. You're not gonna have it. He thought, and I think he did it like just to see if he could. I mean, I think he would have put a metal roof on his house if he could have gotten it approved. But the architect in him was like, and the land use lawyer, like he was uniquely equipped to fight that fight, and he lost.
I think it's great in certain neighborhoods. Like there are certain neighborhoods in Coral Gables that you can't do that. Like everybody has to have a garage. You cannot drive a truck. It cannot be parked in your driveway. Like, there are tons of restrictions, and it's a nightmare. If you choose to buy in that neighborhood and you want to be a part of that aesthetic, that's fine.
Okay, so let's talk about an older neighborhood that's existing. And there's basically a whole bunch of 3-2 concrete block, single-family homes that were built in the 40s, 50s, something like that. And that neighborhood really wants to upgrade. They want to improve. And so the city helps them by enacting aesthetic and architectural standards for home replacement. But you know what? Those standards are going to add $15,000 to the price of every new house that's built there. And someone suffers a casualty. We had a fire. We're going to have to rebuild our house. What do you mean now I have to build that kind of house? I can't just rebuild the house that I had there. It starts a process of gentrification, right? You're pricing out of the neighborhood the people who lived there initially.
Is that a bad thing?
Where should they live? Where?
Somewhere where they can afford it. Sorry, I mean, that's how
In
neighborhoods
their own
improve.
homes?
That's how it doesn't become a hood anymore.
In their own home where they paid taxes now
Yeah.
because of
You
new
think-
regulations?
Okay, I'm saying that it's not, there's two sides to every one of these
Right.
decisions, right?
You could get a grandfather in, right?
Yeah.
Or
There,
if
I've seen this happen. Okay, so after, when was the last, after Wilma. I saw it happen after, I just wasn't in private practice, after Hurricane Andrew. So mobile home parks were so severely damaged in like Southwest Miami-Dade, everywhere. Well, mobile home parks are one of the few types of affordable housing in our community, okay? There are folks who live in mobile homes who really do not belong in apartment complexes, okay? They like to change their own oil, they like to have big dogs, they like to have 30 cats. I mean, it's just a different type of person. Mobile home parks are a place that they can afford to live when they have those kind of, perspectives. But the cities saw an opportunity, many of them did, when there was so much damage to mobile home parks, to try to get rid of them. And they started out with, you've crossed the 50% threshold for non-conform, you can't rebuild the mobile home park. In Miami-Dade County, they gave up the fight, honestly. They allowed every single mobile home park that existed prior to Andrew to be restored if they wanted it to be. Did you have something on that?
Well, that was related to mobile home parks. There was, some years back, there was a mobile home park in Delray. It was called Briny Breezes. And about 600 mobile homes right on the ocean. And this developer came in and wanted to offer them like 600, like each homeowner was about $1 million to give up their
To get the beachfront property.
single wide to get the beachfront property. And the residents turned them down. I'm like, it was baffling.
Yeah, they didn't turn them down on one, but it never went through. And part of the interesting issue there was that Briny Breezes was a town. So the same people who were being offered that money for their homes were the elected officials that were supposed to vote on whether it would be permitted. See the ethical dilemma?
After Irma happened, the same thing, like a hurricane came and wiped them out. The city came in and said, they don't want you rebuilding, it's all, property's all in the water.
Yeah.
I think Carlisle, their hedge fund came in and bought like everything.
There's a process to converting a mobile home park that you have to go through. But even if you managed, as a developer, to do it, to comply with all the requirements, to relocate people in a legal manner and all of that, you comply with all the law and you get to the end and you have vacant land, there's still a policy question going on behind that, because all of those people need to find somewhere to live. And there's a state statute that makes you go through a study to try to prove that there are opportunities for them to move somewhere where they can afford. When I was at the airport did a land expansion back in the 90s, and we acquired 3 mobile home parks. I can't remember now. But because federal money was involved in that project, the federal government had a whole handbook that said, this is what you have to comply with to relocate people from mobile homes. You have to ensure that they have safe, adequate, secure housing to move into. And I mentioned the lady with the 30 cats. She was the last one that we were able to find a place to relocate her to because of those cats. Go ahead.
Don't they just lease the land though, or they own the actual trailer?
Well, there's two kinds. There are mobile home parks where the mobile home owner owns their lot, actual like subdivisions. And then there are mobile home parks where there's a single property owner and all they do is rent a lot and they own only their mobile home. And those are the ones where those are the folks who really have a hard time finding other options. They own a mobile home that in theory they can move to a different mobile home park, but if it's too old, it can't be moved. It costs more to move it than it's worth. It can be hard to find a place that's going to accept your mobile home. So now that person has been convinced to make a $20,000 investment in a home that they own, and then when the property underneath is sold and they have to move, they have nothing really of value that they can take with them. And yet they could still be paying on a loan for that mobile home. It can be really kind of heart-wrenching.
Here's what I don't understand. If I purchase an apartment building and decide to evict everybody in it, I'm not responsible for finding them all homes.
No.
Why am I responsible in a mobile home park?
Because the legislature says so.
No, but that's my question. But why? We're not talking about people that are mentally challenged or like, these are not people that really need my help. This is just the government has decided that this lady wants to keep 30 cats and now she becomes a public burden to me.
Because and I think the public policy behind it is because mobile homes are a large segment of the affordable housing that is available in the state of Florida.
That makes sense.
You know, it's like, it just is. So the legislature stepped in and adopted statutes. Okay, take a break.
No, I mean, this is great. Wow.
Oh, yeah, I need to sit.
Yeah.
That's whatever you want to make it. Just clarify something.
So that one coming?
Yeah. I'll get it ready.
Okay, that might be your case study?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make my case.
Right, if it's in the city, Jacksonville is like a combined city county.
Yeah, I remember when I was in
So you can go to the city's website and see if you can find the same project.
Experience I had. It was
Find out where it is,
project,
you know.
and
So the city and the county is one.
it's a big project.
In Jacksonville,
It was
Florida, yes.
from
What is mobile
Yeah,
home
it's the
park,
only-
like the smaller?
it's the only one in Florida.
Two of them ended up leaving the class.
Don't spread the joy, like.
Another
You're a nuisance to your
party.
party.
Yeah.
So another four of them
Yeah.
ended up, man, I ended up working
Mhm.
with one because it only didn't enter my texts. So I ended up having to do like all the work. Yeah, but isn't that hard? So you don't need to write? Yeah, listen. Wow. I have stuff to go.
Stuff like that.
I said you do anything. Like, what do you normally do?
I want to make sure I wasn't out of material yet.
Oh, yeah, plenty.
Do I have anything? No. This.
This lasts a while.
If I do this,
This will last a while.
Wall Street Journal things going, so I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do that. I'm just hang out. I'm not really doing much.
Do you remember
I'm gonna send you a
eminent
link
domain?
to your email.
Oh, yeah.
Did you do any eminent domain litigation?
We had a course. I went to Chevrolet here, but I didn't take it. Yeah, but there was a course that I didn't take it, but yeah.
What year?
Oh, this is,
What year?
2002. Yeah, so you were, I actually went back, I was in
in the evening program.
But it's
Because I was working for Bell South at the time, and they actually,
Oh,
Once I'm done with
they
that,
actually
so
offered
what I do,
a great
probably,
tuition assistance program.
So how do you wanna go out with?
You
My
can take
father,
advantage
my
of.
father-in-law retired from Bell South.
I wish I could have.
Isn't my new-
If
my
you
new
get in with the old Bell
next
companies at the
year,
right time,
so
there's all timing, most of them are millionaires. You get a great stock.
He retired, he's 84 now, he retired in his late 50s.
I went, no, I went to.
You know, they offered buyouts to some of those middle management people.
Yeah, but a great stock
Yeah,
plan.
he's done fine. Of course, he's
Then I'm here.
extremely frugal, you
Nobody
know,
else because you're.
the greatest generation, whatever, from Wisconsin, but.
Yeah, I kind of call it the tail end. It wasn't too long before it became AT&T, and yeah, things started going awry. And then when they offered that program, I thought, Bill, this might be a good
Thank
time
God I did
to
myself.
get off the ride and maybe look into something else. So
You live with your parents?
it's midlife crisis.
It's not bad.
Yeah.
Do you enjoy it? Do you enjoy
Where do you live?
Practice.
land use law? Do you enjoy the?
I do.
Where do you live?
It-
Oh,
What made it appeal to me was,
But it's gonna be.
I think there was like a latent planner in me my whole life. I remember sitting in the backseat of my dad's car going, why is the road here?
That's too many.
Right.
Why is the intersection there? You know, it was, so the very practical problem-solving aspects of land use and the constitutional implications.
Yeah, so it's,
So it's
near it.
nitty-gritty and it's a big issue.
Yeah.
You know, both of those combined.
I think planning's great. I mean, I think, I look back at, you're familiar with the Rouse Company. They did,
Just walk, yeah, you can do stuff.
I think they did the landing in Jacksonville, I think they did Bayside, Miami. They did the one up in Norfolk, and did Harbor Place in Baltimore, and Columbia, Maryland. But
Never been there?
I used to live in Columbia, Maryland, before I moved down here, I went to
They
University of
have-
Maryland,
they
but
serve the big things.
it's
Behind
absolutely
the
gorgeous. It looks as
Not behind,
good
it's right,
today
it's
as it did when they
like a walk
opened.
away from the door.
I mean, it looks like a,
I go there all the time.
They did a good job of placemaking.
and you would never, I mean, it's something really nice, they plant every tree and every bush and every, you know, so there's nothing, there's no wires, there's no, just that sprawl look. Even though it's in the suburbs, it doesn't look like that, it's a sprawl, so it looks as beautiful today as it did, you know, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, it was opened in 1975, I think, 73, 74, around that age. And, so I think there's something to planning a city, and rather than just let it just, this hodgepodge kind of
Develop
development
haphazardly.
is, yeah, just,
I mean, there's a dark side to it too. You know, the planned communities of the 50s and I mean, it's pretty well documented now that the federal government with redlining participated in the racial segregation of those cities by their lending practices. I mean, there's a dark side to heavy-handed planning that can, you know, make that city not accessible, not available to everyone.
but I mean, I think over time, it's not self-correcting, that's gonna be weeded out, you're gonna.
It has, I mean, it has been, but it's, you know, it's taken federal law regulating the bank's lending practices on the one hand, and it's just, but a lot of it was really, really well hidden at the time that it was going on. So, and they'll still, you know, federal agencies will still find banks, you know, unfairly giving unfair loan offers based on those kind of improper criteria.
Just to drive through it, it's beautiful.
But it makes a beautiful.
Oh, it does. I mean, when it looks as good 50 years later as it did when they first built it, I mean, even the mall, they have a mall there that was built like right around that time, and it's still one of the most beautiful malls I've ever seen. It looks like a brand new. And malls are really going out, you know,
Yeah.
malls, golf courses,
Redevelopment of malls can be fairly challenging also. Repurposing of mall space. It's mostly because of the private agreements, it's more because of the private agreements than it is because of the zoning.
Point is going to Point Beach, because they have a CRA up there, I didn't realize that mall's on its way. That's for sale.
The old Boynton Beach Mall, yeah, where there's a church in there now, they're doing a lot of
Where the Sears was a Macy's, and they're presently a Sears.
In Orlando,
Sears just left.
I don't get that, they want to commute 3 hours.
I didn't know it was
so much money to the point where you need to
Yeah.
move.
Yeah.
Well, it's dying because they,
Yeah.
when retail was really
Because you had to make too
dying, it
much
still is.
When you need to move
And
closer.
They had some strong retail sales over the last couple of holidays,
And you
but
still
what
have
Macy's
to-
does well is the anchors and so does the mall. Macy's was starting to do really well. So I figured, well, maybe the mall's got a chance, but then I heard, I didn't know this, but that was.
People do that, people do that, like constantly, people
Yeah,
go
mall
from San Francisco to
redevelopment
LA.
is,
For work.
so that may be an interesting project to look at is the old mall in West Palm Beach that's now like a lifestyle center. Can't remember what it's called. The old Palm Beach Mall.
Wasn't there a mall up there like Palm Beach Lakes where they changed it to what do we call it, those,
Yeah, it's more open air.
Open air.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, I think.
It's really Pompano like that. The Pompano Mall used to be like a pretty much strip
Traditional mall.
shoebox mall, and
Yeah.
took everything out. Well, not everything. They kept the anchor. Well, they kept
So this is gonna be part of.
Bird Eye slash Mason. They kept that anchor.
A few of the anchors. A lot of the anchors own their own land.
Yeah,
You know.
and the thing is, the anchors they kept are like ones that are sort of hard. Like Sears is one of their anchors. Macy's is one of their anchors. And Lowe's is one of their anchors, but they're doing well. But they kind of like look back in.
Yeah.
What was the reason for the trend of that, going away from malls back to, because it used to be like open air centers, and they went to malls, and now it's, you go back from malls to like open air centers for.
Well, I mean, retail, I think it's just a change in retail to begin with. They couldn't support those rents anymore. They couldn't keep the stores full. And the traffic in the mall just would fall off because of online retailing and everything else. And when anything you can buy at the mall, you can order from Amazon, why should you go to the mall? Okay, so that's why they're converting them to what they call lifestyle centers with entertainment. So you're seeing high-end movie theaters with gourmet restaurants. You're seeing brew pubs with craft brew sites where the food trucks come. So it becomes more, as well as all kinds of entertainment venues. So what's going to get you to the shopping center instead of just doing all your buying online are those experiences. So that's what they're trying to do, is create an experience more than just shopping. And when I worked at a bookstore in college, it was every inch was about selling. Like, why do we have, why have chairs? Why have places where people are going to linger and not buy the books? Sell the books. Every single inch was geared at selling. And it's just changed over time. But that's the only thing that's going to get people away from online buying is the entertainment experience.
But some people still like trying on the clothes.
Try it on and you're ordering
Husbands carrying their wife's purses and sitting in the chair outside the changing room.
Between Walmart and Amazon, the malls just like
I know.
Right, even the open air concept, they literally have to incorporate residential into that somehow, because
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Broward Mall, so there's, residential in the back of the Broward Mall and out here, and so bringing residential onto those vast empty parking fields and building structured parking is another use of the land that's changing.
Was there a time period for eminent domain? They located property, they're gonna put a highway in. I asked this question because in Pittsburgh, the turnpike, they said, okay, we're gonna need this property to build a turnpike, and it took them 30 years to build a turnpike. And they told the people on the land, on the property that they were gonna take, we don't want you to do any improvements to your property. So now
It's just gonna drive the price up.
So
eminent domain there's federal law. Okay, so are we back yet, or we lost one, but is everybody else back? Did we miss anybody else? And this is time killing, but I'll just wait until they talk about this until they get back. So eminent domain law is largely a matter of state law. There's federal outer edges to it, you know what I mean? There's a constitutional, US constitutional provision. But the way that it's done is mostly subject to state law, and each state can be somewhat different. But there are some concepts in eminent domain law that touch on what you're talking about, called pre-condemnation. Like there's one concept, pre-condemnation blight. So if the local government identifies the need for the land and they don't allow you to do maintenance and improvement, or they do things that contribute to the blight of the property, when the purpose is so that they can get it more cheaply, that's generally invalid. You can sue them over that. A property owner can. It's really hard to prove. It can be a difficult proof case. There's also the time period. Like if a project, generally in eminent domain, once a project is announced, then increases and decreases in the property value after the announcement of the project are not taken into account in the valuation. So if Broward County was going to build a new airport, you know, in Weston, and right now the land is all wetland, but the project is announced. It's kind of frozen in time. The property owners won't see any increase in value of the land associated with the announcement of the project, but nor will the local government have the benefit of the depression in the property of the land because of the announcement of the project. That's how it works in theory. So we've talked about some of this already. Why should government intervene in land use markets at all, right? There were early advocates of zoning laws. You know, the first comprehensive zoning code was adopted in New York City in like 1916 or something, and we'll touch on that in the case that upheld that code. But advocates of zoning and land use regulation, they did see a need to create order and beauty in cities, and they saw land use regulations as a means of resolving conflicts in the use of land. One very interesting study, you know, that I learned was about the separation. You'll find that most zoning codes separate uses that are deemed to be incompatible. So there will be residential zoning districts and commercial zoning districts and industrial zoning districts. And mixed uses are becoming more and more common, but there's still an element of most zoning codes that seek to separate uses that are deemed incompatible. And it goes all the way back to the turn of the century, when there were no environmental regulations that were going to stop a factory from spewing smoke. There was no regulation of that. There was no existing regulation to stop them from contaminating the water with their factory. So the only thing that the governments could think to do at that time for the public health and safety was to move them away from the residential areas. So this whole concept of separation of uses is baked into zoning. Now, however, we discover after suburbanization the downside to the separation of uses. You've got residential way out there, and the only way you get there is with a car. And you've got the business district down here, and nobody lives there, so the businesses all shut down at 5 o'clock because there's no residents in the area to keep them active. So the businesses fail, the downtown fails. So that separation of uses started having negative impacts on land development. But that was the early on, that was really all they could think to do to prevent people from being killed by the poison that the factory was putting off and killed in the fires because the buildings were too close together, you know, and suffering from the health effects of no light and no air. But separation of uses got baked in at that early step, and now we're dealing with some of the results. Also, the effect of suburbanization. Everyone has to have a car. No one walks. Health effects. I mean, there's a guy with the Department of Health who has a complete study on how health has declined because people people don't walk anywhere. So these are some of the carryovers from the early implementation of zoning. So the legal basis for land use regulation, it started really in nuisance law. Does anybody know what the term tort means? You know what a tort is? So it's a private cause of action when someone damages you. If you get in a car accident and someone is found to owe you money because they were negligent, that's a tort. They've committed the tort of negligence that caused you harm. One of those causes of action was nuisance, that whatever you're doing, it's causing a nuisance to your neighbor. So there's a whole row of houses and you move in with a tannery or something. I don't know, it's not a use that we have anymore, right? But you start doing something, let's say a dry cleaner, that's noxious, that's just offensive to the adjacent existing uses. That's causing a nuisance. It could be that you have a restaurant and you put an outdoor seating area with live music. And so all of a sudden the noise of operating your business is creating a nuisance for the neighborhood. Well, those kind of claims could be pursued privately under nuisance law. I'm going to go to court and file suit against you for your noisy restaurant because you're damaging me by this nuisance activity. The next phase of land use regulation, though, is based on something different. It's based on what we talked about earlier, that the government should be looking out for the interests of everyone, not just the few, but the whole community. And local governments have the power to regulate for the benefit of the whole community, and it's called the police power. It doesn't have anything to do with police. The police power is the inherent power of government to regulate, to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. That's the police power. So zoning regulations were adopted and were upheld by the courts because they were based on the police power, the power of government to regulate the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. And then we talked about that most extreme form of regulation, eminent domain. It can't be your land anymore, we're going to take your land from you, and that's how we're going to control the use of that land. So what do you think? This is from an early planner type. Unless restrained of this statement, unless restrained by some external force or internal command, mankind incessantly exploits and ultimately despoils or destroys natural environments. Somewhere in the frenzied pursuit of more material possessions and a higher living standard, it is morally necessary to think about what kind of world we'll be passing on to the future generations. That was written like 120 years ago. Sounds very timely, doesn't it? Does that ring true to you? Do you think that left unrestrained, this is what humankind will do to our planet?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so here I'm seeing from some of the younger, what do the older people in the room think? A little bit. Do you think that this is human nature?
Yeah.
Yeah, agree. So then, as we talked about, should land use, considering that, if you think that's really the nature of humankind, should land use decisions be market-based? I would say that your view of human nature says no. Market-based will end up despoiling the earth. Completely market-based. Purely technical, that is, okay, we're going to be very, very specific. You can build this many square feet, but no more. You can build this tall, but not a foot more. Is a technical book of regulations the best way to do this because you're not really bringing any aesthetic judgment to the process? So everybody's got a fair chance. No? Not the best way? Design focused and aesthetically focused? Yes? Structured to serve public policy, like inclusionary or exclusionary. Those terms refer to the affordability. Any mandate to include affordable housing in a development is called inclusionary zoning. We're driven by the availability of facilities to support development. So what if a whole new subdivision of homes would be fine with everybody? Nobody really has any objection, but nobody wants to pay to expand the water and sewer plant that's necessary to service them. Is that the end of the discussion? Should that be the end of the discussion?
impact fees include?
Impact fees are one way to deal with that, yep. So this is the context in which land use controls that you develop, that you encounter now with the project, this is how they've come into existence. Eminent domain, we did some of this. It's the power of government to take private property for a public purpose. It seems like a very simple concept, but it can be difficult to sort out in the litigation. What is that property? Is it, can the government take something less than the entire parcel of land from the sky to the center of the earth? Can they take just the mineral rights? Can they take just the water rights? Should they be able to take just the right to cross it with a trail, but not take the whole property? Those are questions that you encounter in an eminent domain action. What is the public use? Is it an important public use? Is it okay to take someone's land for a park, or should it be something really important like a school or a hospital? Does the degree of, does the importance of the public use matter in this decision? Do you think? It should? You think so? When the airport was expanding, they sought to acquire just navigation easements, just the right to fly over the land. And they fought about it in court for a very long time because the landowners asserted that it didn't leave them with enough. You know, it was doing more harm than the couple $1,000s that you wanted to pay me to be able to fly over my land. And you're dropping jet fuel. We'd say, no, we're not dropping jet fuel. Jet fuel's very, very expensive. Nobody drops jet fuel unless they have to. It was quite a battle. And at one point, a judge in Broward County declined the county's right to take the land for navigation easements. And we went up and appealed and the airport won eventually. So the government wins those fights eventually. And is that right absolute? You know, do you think it's wise that judges get to make those decisions? Do you think that ultimately the government has to provide for the welfare of the city, so they need to be the ones to decide what land they take? Ultimately, no judge can change it. Do you think that would be the better approach? And everybody who buys land knows they're subject, they could be taken for a public purpose at any time. It's baked into the price. What do you think?
Just get a good attorney.
Get a good attorney. And when is the use of eminent domain appropriate and when is it abusive? So how might the use of eminent domain be abusive? Like not really for a true, like a good public purpose. Thoughts?
Yeah, I can't remember. I think it was in New England somewhere, and I know there was like a documentary or a movie about it, but there was this case where it was eminent domain, and like there was this one person that fought back, but the property would be taken to be given to a private corporation.
Yes.
Because the city council figured that this corporation would bring in jobs, so it was for the benefit of the area. But what eventually ended up happening is that the company decided to either not move there or they decided to abandon once they built.
Yeah, so the case name is escaping me at the moment. I should know it. There was a case in New England where the local government condemned the property to give it to a developer to redevelop a community redevelopment area. And the property owner challenged it. It went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court upheld the right of the city to condemn land and hand it to a private developer for redevelopment. That there was the need for redevelopment and the elimination of blight was sufficient basis for that use of eminent domain. But the reaction nationwide was so strong that legislatures all over the country, including in Florida, they modified their eminent domain statutes to prohibit that. So in Florida now, a local government or a community redevelopment agency cannot condemn land and hand it to a private developer. It's prohibited by law now, even though the Supreme Court said that they could. But the reaction, the outrage as a response to that case was so strong that legislatures everywhere, many places, I'm not saying it's all 50 states, but including Florida, said, no, can't do it. So that could be considered, there are people who would consider that abusive because, and though the people who own land in like a waning downtown, a downtown that's really struggling and needs redevelopment, their position is, we want to be part of the redevelopment. We want to participate in the redevelopment so that our land increases in value and we can make the profit on the improvement of the downtown, not some third party who comes in. Let me be part of the solution and improve the value of my own land, along with all boats rise, right? But having it can be very difficult to get to herd the cats, so to speak, of trying to get a redevelopment plan going. So local government's like, this is never going to happen unless we can get private money in here to do it. And the only way we're going to get private money in here to do it is to allow them to assemble for them large enough areas to hand over the whole thing and let them make some money on it. That's the only way it's going to happen. Those are the competing interests. So what can be done short of condemnation? That's what we're talking about. Regulation, something short of condemnation. The constitutional basis for eminent domain, back in medieval times, the king everything belonged to the king, so the king took what he wanted. But under a constitution, there's a provision in the U.S. Constitution that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. And the equivalent version in the state constitution, except for public purpose, and with full compensation, therefore. So that's the difference between the two clauses. The U.S. Constitution is just compensation. The Florida says full compensation. What the Florida courts have construed that to mean has ended up with an eminent domain statute where the condemning authority, the government, has to pay the expenses of the property owner whose land is being condemned. The government pays for the appraisals, pays for their lawyers' fees, pays for all their expert witnesses. So that's considered in the state of Florida to be full compensation. If the landowner had to pay for those things themselves, and let's say the land is worth $10,000 and they get $10,000, but they had to spend $2,000 in expenses to get it, then they're not really getting full compensation. That's the theory behind the full compensation clause in Florida. And it's implemented by the federal government when the federal government is spending the money on the project. As I mentioned, with expansion of the airport, when the airport was using federal money for that expansion, they had to comply with rules that the federal government set. And then every state legislature adopts statutes on eminent domain. And they're both substantive, like they might create different rights in one state or another, like full compensation versus just compensation, and they're procedural. They tell you, the statutes will tell you how much notice the government has to give you, how much information they have to give you about the project. All of those procedural things are there in the statute also.
Do they lay out how your land is evaluated?
They, mostly they'll say that it must be based on appraisals, and the appraisals must be prepared by certified and competent appraisers. In Florida, I think it's through case law, not in the statute. The property owner is allowed to sit on the witness stand and just simply tell the jury what they think their land is worth. And that's considered to be evidence. It might not be the evidence that wins the day, but it's evidence.
So if you had property that was in your family 5 generations, can you attach sentimental value to that?
Well, that's why the property owner gets to testify about their own opinion of value. What's interesting also in Florida is that you're entitled to a jury trial for eminent domain. There are 2 types of cases in which you're entitled to a jury of 12 as opposed to 6. Capital cases, when the state could take your life, and eminent domain. That's how highly the state of Florida has always valued private property rights. If you are entitled to a jury of 12 people to listen to your case in eminent domain to determine the value. It's always been a development state. Land speculators came and started filling the swamps. real estate development is just underlying so much of the economy here in Florida, so that's reflected in the statutes. So, regulatory taking. Regulatory takings, or what is sometimes called inverse condemnation. They say inverse because there's no declaration by the government that we're going to take your land. The government just starts layering regulations on it and burdening it. So the property owner has to come up and say, you have, by the burdensome regulation, taken my land. So it's not an offensive condemnation, it's inverse of that. How much value is lost that is attributable to the regulation? These are some of the questions to ask. Is the property worthless because it's a swamp and it's always been a swamp? Or because a regulation prohibits placing fill in the swamp? Those are some of the questions you go through. If you own land, it's been downzoned, you feel like it's unfair, they've reduced the value of your property to the point that it's a taking. These are the arguments that you have to make, that you have to cut through. Unfortunately, the case law is all over the place on this. The outcomes are completely unpredictable. The standards that the different courts apply are all over. And a lot of judges honestly don't even understand it. It's like they're used to seeing divorce cases or mortgage foreclosure cases or slip and fall cases. They're not used to these at all. So this can be a very difficult row to hoe if you feel like your land has been subject to a regulatory taking. Now, so that's the economic effect of regulation, is one basis for a regulatory taking. The regulation is so burdensome that it really takes all reasonable value out of the land. The other way that a regulatory taking occurs is if the regulation itself doesn't really serve the police power. It doesn't really advance a legitimate governmental interest. I'm just going to let you think about that for a minute. So let's see if we can come up with an example of a regulation of land that doesn't really serve a governmental interest. Yeah?
There's this street in my town, Revere Beach. Back in the day, it was called 8th Street. Very populated. Now, eminent domain was used. All the homes are knocked down. And the street is widened mainly because transportation, the Port of Palm Beach, and tropical shipping. Due to many accidents with 18-wheelers and residents, eminent domain was used, and it was fought, but they lost. For a private industry, they say, but they were able to word it to say, basically it was for the safety of the community.
And it was upheld, and it went forward on that basis.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about not an actual eminent domain like that, but a regulation. What kind of land use regulation might not actually have a valid basis in the police power? Let's say there's a city that is on one of those kind of transportation corridors, and the only thing that gets built on their main road are gas stations and dollar stores. Gas stations and dollar stores, gas stations and dollar stores, and they're sick of gas stations and they want some quality development. So they adopt a regulation that says you can't have any more dollar stores. Is that a legitimate public purpose? Is that a legitimate exercise of the police power? Does that protect the public health, safety, and welfare? No. Yeah, I don't think so either. Up until their fed-up moment, dollar stores and gas stations were permitted in those zones, and then all of a sudden they said we've had enough.
So it can be upheld if there are a lot of deaths in that area.
Well, let's talk about, well, of course now the state regulates safety things around convenience stores, but there was a time when a lot of crimes were happening around convenience stores. So local governments started adopting regulations to require lighting and surveillance cameras and things like that. They're more business regulations than land use regulations, but let's just go with it for now. If the data was there to show that crimes occurred in the absence of lighting and surveillance, then you could make a case that the public safety was being served by a regulation that required convenience stores to have better lighting and surveillance cameras. That's the connection that you have to find under a police power analysis for land use regulation. Is there some negative effect that's being mitigated or improved by this regulation? You know, requirements for parkland. Drainage can be a battle in that way because, yeah, everybody knows that development should be done in a way that it doesn't flood. But you know, every place can flood given enough 100-year storm or 200-year storms back to back or whatever. How much is reasonable to require a developer to do to mitigate flooding to protect the public safety? Those kind of questions. And if the purpose of the regulation is shown to be an improper purpose because we want to exclude poor people, or we want to exclude families with children, or we want to exclude racial groups, if that is proven to be the real purpose of the regulation and it doesn't serve any other benefit for the public, it can be, the application can be deemed a regulatory taking.
What about like moratoriums in relation to all this?
Yeah, so moratoriums become regulatory takings if they go on too long. It's really the bottom line. Moratoria can be adopted for different uses, or for all development, all building permits for an area for a period of time. But the purpose behind the reason that the local government says they need a moratorium, and then how long it is, those are the two essential criteria to determine if a moratorium is going to be valid. If it's going to be for the purpose of studying, of doing a study, okay, medical marijuana dispensaries.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the state has weighed in on that. But when the prospect was there after the constitutional amendment to permit medical marijuana, cities started adopting moratorium on those dispensaries, saying, we need to study this. We need to study how to do this safely. We need to study what standards should be applied to we need to study it. So we're going to put a moratorium down for 6 months. And if you see a city moratorium, 6 months is usually valid. A year, it's probably valid. They get much longer than that, and they're probably invalid. But city attorneys all know that, so they play with that. So those are the purpose of the moratorium matters, and the length of the moratorium. It has to be reasonable, and it has to be reasonably associated to the purpose. How long does it really take to do a study about that? You know, you can't put a moratorium in for 5 years when, if you hire a decent consultant like Aaron, they can do a study for you in 6 months. You know. So those are the two aspects. Those are the two types of regulatory takings. Those that burden the property so heavily that they take essentially all financial value out of the land, and those that have no connection to a valid police power, use of the police power. You're going to need to know about those two, just so you know. Planning in Florida. So Florida is a location that has a lot of natural resources and a lot of resources that are very sensitive. Great places require vision and an understanding of all of the components. Historically, those items were managed by a strong mayor or a community visionary. Now they're addressed through zoning laws and growth management laws. So planning in Florida really, comprehensive planning in Florida really took root. The first Planning Act was, we're going to get into the history, probably in the 70s, but it really became mandatory in 1985, and the first plans had to be adopted by around 87, I think. And it was local government planning had been going on forever in zoning decisions. Zoning regulation was being done, and piecemeal decisions were being made by cities all over the state. And some of them had a plan, and some of them didn't really have a plan. They were if they liked your project, they approved your project and figured that it would improve the tax base, and then they moved on. You know, they moved on to the next decision. This sort of high-level planning wasn't mandatory until the growth management law enacted in Florida. And it started with a state comprehensive plan that had very, very broad policies. And it worked its way down to local comprehensive plans that had to study a whole series of elements, and we'll go through what the mandatory elements are. And the interesting thing is that zoning was just part of it. The comprehensive planning process in Florida required local governments to integrate many different policy decisions. Transportation planning, infrastructure, utility planning, protecting natural resources like beaches and historic resources, all of those things had to be integrated into the zoning decisions. None of them could be done in a vacuum anymore. That was the big overriding effect of comprehensive planning in Florida. And once the comprehensive plan was adopted, it became like the Constitution is. The Constitution remains, unless amended, like over all other laws, right? All other laws must conform to the Constitution. In the land use realm, zoning laws, regulations, and even individual site decisions all had to become consistent with the comprehensive plan. It became the Constitution of land use decisions. Even down to building permits, and so on. Concurrency is a concept that was introduced in the growth management law in Florida, and it means that public facilities and services must be available concurrent with the impact of development. Public facilities and services must be available concurrent with the impact of development. So if you have a big phased project, and you're going to build 100 houses every year, you don't need to have water and sewer for all 300 houses before you pull the first permit. You need to have water and sewer for the 100 as they come online. See what I'm saying? It has to be available concurrent with the impact of that development. Schools became part of it, road capacity, utilities, all of those things. And even parks and even park acreage. Cities have to adopt a park standard. I think most of them in Broward County is 3 acres per 1,000 residents. Parks have to be adequate to serve the new development concurrent with the impact of that development. That's what concurrency means.
I have a question. On the last slide that you had up, so the state would be the state of Florida, local would be the counties.
So city in, okay, oops, this is what I want to do. Local. The state comprehensive plan, there's another step in there that doesn't have much meaning anymore called the regional policy plan, but counties and cities are both considered local governments that must have comprehensive plans. If in Palm Beach County, for example, if the property is located within a city, that city's plan is the only plan you have to worry about. But if the property is located in an unincorporated area, you have to comply with the Palm Beach County Comprehensive Plan. In Broward County, there's an additional layer because Broward County has a county-wide land use plan in addition. So every city has a plan, the county has a plan, and you have to comply with both of them.
But the county's plan would be the one over the city's plan in Broward.
It's a little messier than that, but yes, the city plan must be in conformance with the county plan.
And the county plan has to be in conformance with the state.
With the state plan, okay. And that's not really an issue very often anymore, the state plan. The legislature has, over about the last 10 years, just started giving it back to the local governments. The state oversight of this process has been reduced really every legislative session in the last, since I got to office. So local governments are back in control of most of those decisions now. But there is still a state comprehensive plan, and that has something to say about this. And if a local government adopted a land use plan amendment that violated that state plan, that could be a basis for the Department of Economic Opportunity, the state agency, to challenge it. So Florida, you know, why did Florida become a growth management state? You know, there's really not that many of them. I mentioned Washington, Oregon, California, Florida. That it's because of the natural resources and the sensitivity to development that exist here because of our natural resources. It's also, you know, Florida gets thousands of new residents every single day. The sunshine, the weather, the low tax structure here, that we have no state income tax. This is a magnet state for population movement, and they're going to come. So the question of if you build it, you know, will they come, or they're coming. You got to find some place to put them, and that's really the situation we have in Florida. Population is moving here constantly, and planning is necessary to accommodate all that population in a way that doesn't destroy the natural resources and the quality of life that makes our state so appealing. Shifting economics come into play here. You know, agriculture was the dominant industry in Florida for a very, very long time. It might still be pretty more significant than we down here in the city realize. But tourism, of course, the creation of retirement living, all of those things are statewide industries that are taken into consideration in these land use planning decisions. And then there's new industry, right? Everybody wants, all of these cities want new industry, clean industry. They want tech workers. They want solar businesses. There's always a cutting edge of industry that needs to find some place to operate. And states, for economic development, need to be ready to receive those kind of industries because they create high-value jobs and the tax revenue associated with it. So generational, they're one state or three. There are really three regions. Florida is really 3 different states, if you haven't experienced that, right? The north, there's Southeast Florida, Southwest Florida, and the rest of Florida, and the culture in those areas is really quite different. It was a comedian who said that his parents, he grew up on Long Island, his parents reached a certain age, they moved to Florida, it was the law, right? So Southeast Florida is full of retirees from the Northeast. When I did my first year of law school at Stetson on the west coast of Florida, and all of the retirees, so most of the retirees there are from the Midwest. Very, very different culture there than Southeast Florida. And then there's the rest of Florida that thinks that we're all crazy down here. So, generational differences about what lifestyle is desirable. This is a growing pain that we experience in Florida also, right? There was 30 years when retirement condominiums controlled the politics of Broward County. And those communities just don't exist anymore. Old people as they age don't even really want to live in those age-restricted communities as much as they used to. So those generational shifts are happening. And the cost of infrastructure, what it's going to cost to cure existing deficiencies, and then who should bear those costs. Those questions come into play in land use decisions also. Road construction, there's a desire through impact fees and fair share contribution requirements to make the developers pay the full cost of the infrastructure needs that their development will have. But sometimes it reaches back, and they want the new developers to cure the deficiencies that the local government has failed to provide for over years and years and years. That's not really fair. What that does is burden the users of that new development with all of the unsatisfied needs of the community that the local government failed to address for 30 years. So finding that line of making new development pay its own way and not trying to make new development pay to cure existing deficiencies, that's a hard line to find sometimes. This was a
talking to one of the architects at my last firm, and he was saying how, cause he actually used to be a city architect for Fort Lauderdale, and how they've been approving all these like really high density projects, whereas the infrastructure below, like in New York City, for instance, they have the subway system and stuff, so they have space to fit all the necessary infrastructure, and then here we are. I mean, I don't start keeping until Monday, so I'm not familiar with a lot of the civil engineering aspects yet, but I mean, where do you foresee that? Like, because a lot of the pipes, I mean, pipes bust in downtown Fort Lauderdale like all the time.
The water and sewer in Fort Lauderdale has been an issue for a long time. The thing is, there is technology to solve it. There, you know, I happen to represent somebody who did that. They have mechanisms of resurfacing those pipes from the inside, basically, so they don't have to tear up the road. But it's really all a matter of money, and what the city just doesn't seem to be inclined to explain itself to people. But the density, you know, I really love that we're starting to have a real downtown in Fort Lauderdale now. That's closer to 24 hours and all of that. My husband and I are like getting ready to renovate the house, sell it, and move down. I see the appeal of it. So I don't know the details of every single project decision. I've permitted some projects down there, and I've advised buyers who are buying entitled projects and then building them, and also buyers who are buying existing projects. So I've done the land use diligence on them. I think it's cool. I think they should keep it up. I don't think they should back away. But I'm a development lawyer, so there you go. That's my perspective. But it's true. The water and sewer capacity, those things can cause a screeching halt to a development arc that's going on in the community. So the local government really does have to take it very seriously. What some cities are suffering from is a loss of staff.
Yeah.
So staff, you know, the cities don't keep up with the employment policies that are going to keep those people there long term. They get tired of the low salaries and, you know, the political shenanigans, and they eventually go into private industry. But city staff really suffers from the loss of continuity in their staff. I just dread finding out, you know, oh, you mean we're on our third planner on this project because they keep leaving to go to another city? Yeah, it happens all the time. So this is more about the comprehensive planning process that was put into place under the Growth Management Law, which is Chapter 163, Part 2 of the Florida statutes. And this was kind of what you were asking about, the structure of the relationship of those plans. If you look at the straight line, you go down from a state comprehensive plan to a local comprehensive plan to the land development regulations, which include zoning regulations, and then the actual local development orders, which are the decisions on individual projects. They all have to be consistent up the line. So the history of this kind of growth management system in Florida goes back to the 70s. Like I said, zoning decisions have been going on for 100 years. I mean, nationwide, there was a model zoning code that some form of it was adopted in almost every state. And it was premised upon the idea that the state legislature had to give this power to the city. The city didn't have the power inherently without that legislative action. And that's the way it was in Florida up until the 1968 Constitution. Under the 68 Constitution, the idea of home rule was created. So the legislature said to cities and counties, you have all power to exercise the police power unless it's inconsistent with state law. So see the difference. Instead of the legislature saying, city, this is what you can do, and no more. You have no power unless you're within these lines. Instead, the legislature said, city, you can do anything to protect the public health, safety, and welfare through regulation, unless we say otherwise or it's inconsistent with state law. That concept is called home rule. So in Florida, the model zoning code disappeared, it wasn't necessary. Local governments had the home rule power to adopt local zoning, and that's what they did from the 1968 Constitution until the growth management movement started in the 70s. And the growth management movement it grew out of a concern for environmental, the impact on the environment of rampant or uncontrolled or just really poorly thought out development decisions. Because there's so many natural resources that are so valuable in Florida, the environmentalists were really behind the development of growth management in Florida. Developments of regional impact that we talked about earlier, the Land and Water Management Act, so an environmental law, followed by the DRI law, and then the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act, which didn't really have any teeth to it. There was nothing that required local governments to comply with that. It was just kind of hanging out there. Those were the first attempts to introduce a more comprehensive planning requirement into development decisions in Florida. In 1984, the State and Regional Planning Act was adopted. So that's what the legislature told the governor to prepare a state comprehensive plan, and then the regional planning councils, I think there were 5 of them. Like the South Florida Regional Planning Council includes what's the county of Monroe is the Keys, right? So Monroe, Miami-Dade, and Broward. The Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council is Palm Beach, Martin, and St. Lucie counties. But they were told to develop regional policy plans, and then this statute created a strong state agency to administer this program, which at that time was called the Department of Community Affairs. And then the next year, the Growth Management Act was adopted, which really, really put teeth into this process. It mandated the adoption of local plans. It set minimum standards for those plans. It was like the planning consultant's bill of relief, because local governments didn't have this expertise, a lot of them at that time. And the elements, there were specific elements. And if a local government failed to adopt a comprehensive plan that met all these standards, the state would withhold all kinds of state funding. That's where the teeth came from. So there was an administrative law process to determine if the local government failed. You got all your due process, but eventually, if a city failed to adopt a comprehensive plan, the state government would withhold money. That was the teeth. And it worked. Local governments adopted their comprehensive plans.
Is this where the urban development boundary popped up?
The urban development boundary was just one of Miami-Dade's strategies to control development. I mean, and many other jurisdictions that had a substantial amount of rural land, as well as cities, created something similar to the UDB. In Broward, it wasn't an issue because 2/3 of Broward County was in the Everglades west of 27 anyway, and already under, in public ownership or under environmental protection. Broward, that's like our line was already drawn, and it was really not much of an issue in Broward. But again, other areas of the state that had substantial rural and agricultural lands, most of them did draw a boundary. And the boundary served a lot of purposes. It wasn't just a way of saying, yes, you can develop here, and no, you can't, but it designated the area where they were going to make the investment in infrastructure to support development too. So it protected property owners from being told, you've got to extend water and sewer out. So it worked for both. It worked for both the development community and the local government.
What's the rule of, like, say I bought like acres of land out west or whatever, and it wasn't used for anything. Well, I didn't know what the use was, but and say you wanted to use that dirt for fill for other investments. Is there a law against that? Thinking out loud.
Local governments will have regulations on dredging and filling. The state has regulations on dredging and filling, and the federal government, Army Corps of Engineers, has regulations on dredging and filling. If it has any connection to to waters of the United States. That's the jurisdiction of the Army Corps. We'll get into the weeds on that too. So then the state comprehensive plan was adopted, which provided this sort of long-range policy guidance. In 1990, the Florida Preservation 2000 Act created a source of revenue for the acquisition and protection of natural resources, and it's been plundered for other purposes over the years.
You said plundered?
Plundered, yes, for other purposes.
It's been misused, is what you're saying?
It's been put to other purposes, yes. And then in 1995, so when we talked about regulatory takings, I was saying that all of those standards are interpreted by different courts in different ways. It's very, very hard to make a case for regulatory taking, in part because judges and courts land all over the place. Very, very unpredictable. And one of the places that became, one of the decisions that became very unpredictable was, did we really take all reasonable use of your property or just some of it? So the Burke-Harris Act was adopted by the Florida legislature to create a remedy for regulatory impacts that that don't rise to the level of a taking. It's called undue burden. So now the courts fight about what undue burden means instead of fighting about what all economically viable use of the land is. It just moved the line, but they're still fighting over the line. But the Burke-Harris Private Property Rights Act does create a remedy and a cause of action to seek compensation for the impact of regulatory burdens, even if it's not a taking. It's kind of a novel concept. This is the litigation lawyer's bill of relief. You know, it's really hard to make a case, I think. So the way that something like that would happen is, let's say you own property on the beach or on a barrier island, and when you bought the property, you could build 15 stories and, you know, density of 50 units per acre. And then the local government adopts a new regulation that says, no, 10 stories, 20 units per acre for the whole barrier island. And they've got a good reason. Let's say it's hurricane evacuation or something. That's their reason. But what the Burke-Harris Act allows you to do is do an appraisal under the regulations in effect when you buy your property, do an appraisal under the new regulations, and say, look, you just cost me $10 million in property value. I'll take a check. You know, that's really what goes on in a Burke-Harris Act, is a battle of how much value was lost as a result of these new regulations. It doesn't have to be all value. Getting to build 10 stories and 20 units per acre, that's still a decent development opportunity. It wouldn't have been a taking, but under the Burke-Harris Act, it might give you compensation for the reduction in value. So then in 2005, the legislature adopted a bill that strengthened concurrency, again, put more requirements on local government to prove that all those facilities were going to be in place at the time that the development happened. Then we had a change in Tallahassee, a very substantial change. And in the next series of pieces of legislation, they backed away on all of those concurrency requirements. They started eliminating the requirements for DRIs over a series of legislative changes. They repealed the very, very detailed rules about what the comprehensive plan had to cover. They put some of those things in the statute, and they said everything else is a local decision. They started handing more and more of the decision-making back to the local governments. From my perspective, it made sense, because 15 years of comprehensive planning had resulted in cities and counties having very strong local staff who could administer these programs. They weren't just saying, yeah, we like your project or we don't. You know, they were capable, the cities, of conducting this kind of planning, and they had their own comprehensive plans to enforce. It wasn't like, you know, Katie bar the door kind of thing. It wasn't a wild the Wild West. From the perspective of environmentalists and growth management, proponents, it was letting the fox back into the hen house. So there's still tension there. And in this legislative session that just ended, I don't know if the governor has signed, I don't think the governor has signed the bill, but a bill was adopted that made it harder for community activists to file lawsuits over developments that were approved. So again, the legislature in its current political mode is encouraging development. They're rolling back constraints on development. And one of those things is to make it more difficult for neighbors to sue to prevent these projects from happening. And this was a whole series of legislative changes that rolled these protections back to some extent. So we talked about nuisance. So all of this, detailed and comprehensive land use planning structure now exists, and it requires a lot of expertise and a lot of professionally qualified people to implement it. But it all started, back at the turn of the century, when really the only thing you could do if you didn't like what your neighbor did with their land was sue them in court for nuisance. That was the origin of it. The nuisance cases are kind of interesting to read. Like this case called Hadachek. There was a brick manufacturing facility in Los Angeles, and it had existed there for years. And then residential development grew out to it, right? You should think that's their problem. Why should that affect my brick manufacturing? But the court held that the owner of the brick factory didn't have a right to continue that use that was now, incompatible with the residential that grew to it, because to so hold would preclude development and fix a city forever in its primitive conditions. There must be progress. And if in its march private interests are in the way, they must yield to the good of the community.
It's like an eminent domain argument.
Basically.
It's like what?
Like an eminent domain argument, basically. Like it has the same principles as eminent domain.
Yeah, I mean it does, but it's nuisance. So the people, the newcomers came and they built their house right next to the brick manufacturing company, and then they complained about the smoke and the noise of the brick manufacturing company. You should win that nuisance case, right? The brick manufacturer was there first, but the court ruled the other way, and it was a shift to making decisions based on the greater good rather than the individual rights of the property owner.
Did he have to seize the property, or did he just have to stop making bricks?
He probably just had to pay money because it was just a private lawsuit. It wasn't the government at all. It was one property owner suing his neighbor about what was going on the property.
So just settle with money and they continue to make bricks?
They might, I don't remember, they might have gotten an injunction or something, but again, it was still just one property owner against another property owner, not a decision made that would affect the whole community. In Pennsylvania coal, so we're talking 1922, there was, it was in Pennsylvania, so coal mining was a big industry. And there was a law preventing mining that would cause subsidence in residential areas. And the court said the government could hardly go on if to some extent values incident to the property could not be diminished without paying for every such change. But the implied limitation must have limits. See what I mean? These are complicated. When it reaches a certain magnitude, in most, if not all cases, there must be an exercise of eminent domain. That's at what point does it become a taking? And this was a lawsuit over a law that prevented mining that would cause subsidence. And so the effect was to defeat a coal mining private property owner from using an easement that they had. Okay, So it's a mining business, and they purchased an easement to go under these properties, to dig, to mine under, but it was causing subsidence of the homes. They had paid for that property right, and the court said, no. Said, no, you can't. The law that prevented you from using your property right of digging under the homes is valid. So that was the outcome of the case. So how do we get from nuisance to zoning? Nuisance cases had their limitations. They were limited to those two parties, that property, those particular facts. And they delivered very disparate results. One judge on one given day might have ruled one way, and the same set of facts in a different court with different parties, the court could have ruled the other way. There was no, you had no expectation of what the outcome would be. In this case, Euclid, it upheld the validity of the very first comprehensive zoning code that established permitted uses in zones. And this case gave rise to a term that was still in effect today called Euclidean zoning. Most of the zoning codes that you encounter today are based on this: the separation of uses, the delineation of the land into zones, and the designation of permitted uses in each of those zones. That's the base of it. It started in 1926, and we're still dealing with it today. Euclidean zoning. So we talked about one form of regulatory taking if the zoning regulation goes too far. This Penn Central case in New York City is a Supreme Court case that addresses regulatory taking. The standard established by that court was whether the economic impact of the regulation destroyed the reasonable investment-backed expectations. And that has become a standard that other courts have used over and over and over again. What are the reasonable investment-backed expectations that are affected or damaged or diminished by the regulation? And this, because it was the issue of development of airspace above a historic property, this is the first case where we see something called transferable development rights. Have any of you heard that term? So, for example, in Miami, in downtown Miami, historically designated sites can sell their excess development rights elsewhere in the city. And the city has requirements that you reinvest a certain amount of the money into the historic property to maintain it. Because what was happening to historic properties was benign, like deliberate neglect. So somebody has a historic church building downtown, but they're a private property owner. They want to sell it for redevelopment, but it's historically designated. They can't touch it. So they let it decline until the point that it can't be saved. And then the historic board has to approve the demolition because it's unsafe. And then, miraculously, they get their land available for redevelopment. So to stop that from happening, cities have created transferable development rights that allow historic property owners to essentially sell the air rights, or to sell the development rights that would exist in the air above the property to other developers. And it works to help preserve the historic properties. And this is, we touched on this, zoning regulations are an exercise of the police power. It's the inherent power of government to enact and enforce regulations for the protection of public health, safety, welfare, and morals. To be a valid exercise, there must be a nexus, a relationship between the perceived harm and the requirements of the regulation. So there was a case in the Keys about a stormwater impact fee, and eventually the city won, but it went through a few twists and turns because the property owner was able to show that they were being required to pay a stormwater fee to drain into a basin that they had no connection to. So there was no nexus between the mandatory fee and any benefit to the property. That's how they won at the trial court level. Eventually, they lost, and they had to pay the fee. Nolan versus California Coastal Commission is another important United States Supreme Court case about regulatory takings. So the Nolans wanted a permit to demolish an existing beachfront bungalow and construct a new house. The Coastal Commission in California required that they dedicate a lateral public easement parallel to the ocean across their property. Okay, so are we picturing it? There's a lot on the beach, and to rebuild their house on the beach, the government said, we want you to create an easement to allow people, the public, to walk across your beach from one side to the other. The asserted public purpose was to maintain public view of the ocean. But the court held that there must be a rational nexus between that purpose and the condition. And Justice Scalia wrote, unless the permit condition serves the same governmental purpose as the development ban, the building restriction is not a valid regulation of land use, but an out-and-out plan of extortion. Because when you think about it logically, an easement that allowed people to walk along the beach, that didn't improve visual access to the beach at all. The stated purpose of the regulation was not actually served by the regulation, and that made it invalid. And this case has lots and lots of implications, like, I'm trying to think of one, a good one.
So what exactly happened? So what was invalidated?
So the California Coastal Commission's demand that they dedicate this easement was invalid.
I see.
And they were permitted to, the court was essentially saying that cannot be a condition of this project.
Isn't it, don't the ocean beachfront belong actually to the federal government in the sense that all the way up until high tide, that you can't prevent someone from being able to walk on the beach, or?
It varies from state to state, actually. It does. The sovereignty, like in Florida, we have sovereignty submerged lands. They're defined at a certain way, but it can vary from state to state depending on the land. Actually, the land grants that created the state to begin with. It can vary. I mean, I'm sure there are similarities in high water, low water, in those kind of standards, but it can vary.
What's the term that they use for the one that's like the rights if you live on like a river or something?
Riparian rights. If you own property adjacent to a waterway, you have right to access the waterway. That's called a riparian right. It generally comes with the ownership of land adjacent to a river.
You say waterway, you don't necessarily mean navigable. It could be a creek.
It doesn't really matter if it's navigable.
Okay.
Because like if you're doing like a marina or something, because I was like putting together plans for that, like we could go out like 200 feet or something, but that was like the zoning code.
In Florida, the state of Florida owns what's called sovereignty submerged lands. How they're measured, where you find the line is not, it's engineers do that. Yeah. But a lot of marinas are built on a combination of private submerged land and state sovereign submerged land. And what you'll find with those projects is, okay, there's a deed to property and there's also a lease to the sovereignty submerged lands. So you get a lease from the state of Florida to extend your marina into the sovereign submerged lands. And to do that, you have to visit the governor and the cabinet, sitting as the board in charge of controlling state land, basically. So a lot of those projects, again, if you're looking at buying a marina, that's what you're going to find in the big pile of documents that you get to start looking at. Here's your deed, here's your zoning, here's your sovereignty submerged land lease. And you need to know what the terms are of it and how often you have to renew it, and consider the fact that if the state takes it back, what's your, do you still want the project? But this rule, this rational nexus rule, it is an important one to know. That there must be a rational connection between the public purpose and the condition. So if the government is imposing a condition that doesn't really serve the public purpose that they're stating, it's going to be an invalid condition. Dolan versus the City of Tigard was an extension of this case, was another Supreme Court case that kind of gave some color to that rule. The city, someone wanted to expand her, I think it was a hardware store, and pave the parking lot. The city required us conditions to that approval that she dedicate land for a greenway along with the adjacent creek and install a pedestrian and bicycle pathway. The Supreme Court